This is on, right? People can hear me? Yes, that's the first administrative thing I had to say. This will be recorded. So if you are asking a question later on, just to bear in mind, if you don't want to be recorded, you can talk to us later, maybe in the break. So I want to just take this opportunity, because our director unfortunately could not, to welcome you all to this event. And I'm very happy to see so many people here, both colleagues, people from the ETUC, and participants who are interested in the topic, for this event on gender equality, on getting equal. So what we wanted to do with this is just essentially give a showcase of the work the ETUI is doing on this topic and start a discussion. And we're really counting on all of you to get involved with us, discuss, ask questions, tell us aspects we forgot or are missing, because this is the aim is to be a sort of ongoing conversation on this issue of gender equality in the world of work, which, as we were preparing for this conference, we were looking at the fact that a lot of work is happening in the ETUI, but it's relatively disparate. So we really wanted to take this opportunity. Of course, bearing in mind International Women's Day was the sort of catalyst for doing this event, but to really just highlight the different aspects of equality in the world of work and gender equality we're looking at, and start a debate on that and really just showcase the different aspects we're doing. And we're very, very happy that to open this session, we have Isabel Schömann, who can speak, who is Deputy General Secretary at the ETUC, and also is responsible for the gender equality agenda. And so, Isabel, the floor is yours. Then there will be a little bit of time for questions and answers, and then we'll start with the first panel.
No, it's weird. So, good afternoon, and indeed from that angle is very impressive. Sitting on the first row, you don't see it, but the room is full, and thank you for your interest. It's okay, it's okay. Thank you for your interest, and thank you for joining, indeed, this event organized by the ETUI. Very important, of course, the work, the research, and the training that the ETUI is organizing, and you know the ETUI is also there to support and stimulate the ETUC, what the ETUI does very well, and in particular to help the ETUC to be prepared for the advocacy work that we have to do, in particular for the issue of gender equality, for which, as Wood has mentioned, I'm responsible for, and work very closely with Aline Bruser, advisor at the ETUC on this issue. For us, it's very important indeed, and I will give you a bit of flavor of where we are, what we do. In particular here, the ETUC has something special in terms of recognizing the gender equality dimension. Of course, the role of women is, of course, that we have a permanent committee, which is a women committee. And this is also something which is in the statutes of the ETUC, which gives you the importance that the ETUC gives to the issue related to the support and the empowerment that women have to have, and how the ETUC is very well aware and working for that. There are only two permanent committees. This is the Women Committee and the Youth Committee. And one of the actions that we are preparing together with the ETUI is, of course, to bring the young ladies, the young trade unionists within the Women Committee, and to make sure that we have this renewal of the generations. For us, very important to bring further the work and the fight to make sure that women are respected on an equal basis. So I will address 5 points, so stay with me for those 5 points. The first one is, of course, what is very much at the heart of the trade union movement is, of course, to secure equal pay for equal work of equal value. And this is very important. We have a directive, which is the Pay Transparency, the Gender Pay Transparency Directive, which has been adopted in 2023. Should be transposed by the 7th of June 2026, so we have a bit of time, and this is what we are working on, in particular at the ETUC, in making sure that not only do we work in terms of organizing and liaising with our affiliate, but we also work with the Commission because the Commission has started organizing a transposition workshop, which are unofficial, a bit of a pity, but where we are very much involved, asking the questions that are not easy to reply to, but also testing the water when it comes to certain member states, willing or not willing to transpose, and how to transpose the directive. And of course, the employers, the other side of the room, the employers present, the social partners are present. So we, and on the other side, the employers, and of course, to see what the employers, the strategy of the employers. And I just give it to you as I got it. At the coffee break, the first meeting we had organized by the Commission, the employers coming to me and say, it's going to be too complicated. I think we won't manage. And I reply, it's not a question of whether you will manage or not, you have to. I can tell you at the ETUI, we already have done the issue of how to secure the informations on the gender pay gap. It just takes a click, because the software is there, because the information are there. So don't tell me it's too complicated. And now the next narrative is, of course, we have to simplify, and they dare to put on the table the pay transparency to be simplified. So here, something that we are very much aware of and have identified, and against which we've been working ahead of the 8th of March. Thank you for mentioning that, Wouters. We did that, and we clearly said that it's not up to the woman to pay the bill. And indeed here, we calculated, thanks to the ETUI, that the blockage of the employers would cost us 10 million, working women about 1.5 billion euros a year. And this is something that if the employers put on the table such numbers in terms of the burden for them, we have to put indeed where the burden is, and the burden lies with the women, not with the employers. So this is clearly something that we were able to manage and to bring on the table. The employers don't like that, but that's the game. And then, of course, here we can also come with fact. What we have also seen is that what I have been mentioning is that the simplifications, massive, and I quote, massive simplification wave of the Commission, quoting Ursula von der Leyen and Commissioner Séjourné, is coming and will certainly affect in a way or the other the issue of pay transparency, not only because the employers have put that on the table and of course have in contacted Commissioner Mitsatu, responsible for social rights, to organize some simplifications when it comes to pay transparency, but that we also see at the Council committee meeting that took place on the 6th of March, that the Council is also looking at further simplifications packages, and here looking at the whole acquis communautaire, not just the social acquis, but also the social acquis, and that we can expect from them to press from the employer side, but also from the Council side, to pressure for having simplification in terms of, in particular, the reporting. That's what we have experienced in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. But of course, here for the pay transparency is the reporting on the information that we need to have to showcase whether or not there is a gender pay gap. And of course, this is very important information that women's and trade unions defending women should have. This is one element, what the employers also want, and what we also have or will find in the next simplification package is, of course, to use the thresholds above which or under which you have to deliver these informations. We know that we have the definition of the SMEs. So SMEs are enterprises having from 0 to 250 employees, but here we do see that there is an attempt to twist this threshold, and to make sure that the highest number of businesses having a highest number of employees, so more than 250, do not need to have to report. And I think this is something that we have identified in many occurrences, to try to use this leverage to exempt small and medium-sized enterprises to report, and of course to report on the pay gap, which is an obligation. So it's not, you don't have the choice. You have to do it, and you have to do it for the purpose of closing the gap. And this is not here to incentivize businesses to do it. It's of course to make sure that this legislation is enforced. and not simplify in a way which is affect the existing protections for the workers and here for the women. We also have identified that they are trying to introduce what we call the presumption of appropriateness. It's a bit complicated as a formulation. It boils down to if there is a collective agreement in place, the workers do not have to have the right to ask for the informations, because these informations from the employer should be, somewhere in the collective agreement. Of course, this is a shortcut that we don't accept. I think there is an obligation of the employers toward the individual, and of course, this obligation has to be respected, and of course, it has to be accessible for the trade unions. So I think it's mixing here two things that do not belong together, for the sake of simplification again. And the other attempt that we have identified that was already back in time on the table because the employers don't like it is, of course, they are targeting to undo the hypothetical comparator and want to reduce it to compare the situations within the company and where the company has control of, so within their own setting, and do not want to look into the subsidiaries, for example, which is, of course, not acceptable. So all of that and some more is what we have identified, and of course what we are fighting for in terms of making sure that the Commission incentivize the Member States and of course give to the Member States some tools to implement properly the pay transparency, but it's not to be taken for granted that it happened, and this is the reasons why we have asked the Commission very clearly not only to have this unofficial kind of gathering where we discuss nicely and we most of the time don't get the answers we need, but of course to have a structured process of transpositions where we also have not only the minutes of the meeting, but of course a report where, like we have for the minimum wage, explain the directive and of course explain the way each article has to be transposed, and if there are different views in the room between, for example, the employers and the trade unions, then those different views should be explained. We've done it for the minimum wage. We should be able to do it on the pay transparency. So this is one element, and of course on the pay transparency there is a lot to say. What we have, and I won't move too much on that because Aline is going to present that to you, is of course a project, what we call the Wager project, where we of course are looking into not only how best to transpose the pay transparency, but to make sure that our affiliates are equipped, very well informed about what is happening, and of course that we support each other in terms of the transpositions and make sure that we get the information we should get and to close the gender pay gap. That was the first point. The second is, of course, a very well-known point, unfortunately, because it's a difficult one, is, of course, the fight against violence against women, and in particular the workplace. This is one of the priority of the ETUI from the very outset, and this is where we have a project indeed. Where we have organized all the information needed to make sure that the fight against violence at the workplace towards women is stopped, and we have the ammunition to fight against that. And here, sorry, Eileen will speak about that much more than the other one. My mistake. She can also speak about the two projects. And this one is of course, something where we have not only identified, but alerted about what is happening. And of course, in particular, when it comes to the different form of violence for which we are not all of us equipped, the cyber violence in particular, the abuses that we have in terms of discrimination when it comes to the introductions and the use of AI in the workplace. We know about the bias in terms of the gender, but not only in terms of hiring and firing, but of course in terms of the duplication and the exponential discriminations along the line of how those algorithmic management are developed. And this is something that we need clearly to fight. We also know and we've been working myself 2007 on the European Framework Agreement against violence and harassment at the workplace. Interestingly enough, and I was a bit surprised by that, I must say, there is no gender dimension in it. So it's for everyone, but of course we know that the women are more targeted than any other group of the society, and in particular the workplace. So here, clearly something that we have identified to be reviewed, revised. However, clearly here we need to have the right political context to sit together with the employers, which is currently, to my understanding and to my experience, not really delivering for a good discussions, let alone a good negotiations. I just want to recall that we have negotiated the right to disconnect with the employers, a new right, together along how best to organize or reorganize the telework dimension after COVID. We had already back in time a telework agreement. We had the text. After more than a year of negotiations, we had a text, and the employers felt they needed a bit of time to reflect. And so what? And it was about 4 weeks. And no, 4 weeks, it's a joke. No, we potentially more, and we understood that it was a way to say they don't want to sign. So of course we lost a lot of time. Fortunately for us, and thanks to the Treaty of the European Union, we have the possibility, when we do not are able to finalize the negotiations, to give the dossier back to the Commission, and for the Commissions to move on with a legal proposal, because we have identified ahead of our negotiations the fact that the topic at stake, and here the issue of the right to disconnect, was important for the Commission to act. So here the file is back in the Commission's hands, and we expect the second stage consultation, but for the right to disconnect, not for the violence. But on the violence, indeed, we have an agreement of 2007, potentially to be reviewed, to see whether the context is okay or not. But we are, of course, calling, and this is the first priority of the ETUI, calling for a European directive eradicating gender-based violence at the workplace. There is already a directive, but this directive does not include the issue of the workplace. So we don't have the legal base to make sure that we, the trade unions, are able to be to prevent this violence, and to make sure that the right procedures and the right tools are present at the workplace, including, of course, the issue of cyber violence, but including the issue of domestic violence, because if we speak about telework, we are clearly here in a situation where we cannot be or ignore the issue of domestic violence. What we are also campaigning for is the ratification, full employment of the Convention 190 of the ILO. So this is, of course, where the European Union and each member state has to be very mobilized. And of course, along those lines, the Istanbul Convention, which is, of course, very important to secure this mainstream of indeed protecting the women against violence. So this is the second point for us. What we've been doing also at the ETUI since the Congress 2023, is to of course mainstream the issue of gender equality throughout the different dossiers, and it's exactly what is my third point. We don't just address issues of gender equality within a closed shop. On the contrary, we are very much mainstreaming it in terms of health and safety at the workplace. And here the next steps to look into is, of course, the psychosocial risk that is should be in the pipeline and in the work program of the Commission, whereby to see what the Commission will propose. But of course, ETUI should be also on the lead, looking, for example, at Spain. When we are speaking about menstrual leave, we also be in the front line when we are speaking about menopause leave. And this is all what is needed to indeed break the stigma in terms of the workplace and what is affecting, in particular, the women, and where we should care. We are also doing that in relations to artificial intelligence or algorithmic management. We have had different occurrences, 2 resolutions and a strategic discussions at ETUI on the issue of artificial intelligence, particular algorithmic system. We are requesting for a directive here again because the workplace on the existing AI is not covered properly. We don't have the legal base to be able to act. So all the more important that we have another directive where we be able, of course, to tackle the issue of fighting against discriminations against women through algorithmic management. We are also looking into mainstreaming the issue of gender in what we call, dossiers within the frame of democracy at work, which is, of course, looking at the collective dimension, the collective rights. And here, you all know that we are in the course of hopefully finalizing the revisions of the European Workers' Council Directive, where the dimension of gender is brought, and it is good. So, as an obligation of mean, clearly here, we can't have an obligation of result for the moment, for the simpler reasons that should we have that, and we know from the praxis that we, in certain circumstances, not be able for European Works Council to bring as many women colleagues as men, that the outcome of that, if we would have a result of obligations to have a quota, for example, the result would be no European Works Council. And this is not something that we can afford. So all the more important that we have this obligation of mean, but that should not prevent a European Works Council to be set up. And this is what we are discussing for the moment. And I would like also to thank the ETUI colleagues for being so supportive in that dossier, with the hope that the trilogue, which is ongoing, will be finalized by the end of June. This is what we are expecting. We are also looking at, of course, the transposition of the directive, which is the gender balance amongst director of listed company. We call it the woman on board. I think it's more straightforward. Here, the deadline for transposition was of December of last year. And we will be working on the implementation report for December of this year, which is very important for us to make sure that here, indeed, we have the quota that we need. And the last project that I would like to mention, but here we are very much looking also at the very next outcome, and also thanks to the colleague from the ETUI to be with us on that. It's the project that we have called Union Voices, Women Leading the Way. And this is where we would like to bring the young women on board, and then where we are at the ETUC try to bring together the Youth Committee and the Women's Committee to make sure that at least at the next Congress of the ETUC 2027, we will have young women on board in all the delegations. We have already a quota. We have already managed the quota of having equality between men and women in the delegations of the affiliates attending the ETUC. Now we have to have more young women to those delegations. So this is the aim, and for that, the ETUI has been very much instrumental to make sure that we were able to interview all the trade union women leader affiliated to the ETUC to give us a bit of their personal journey, of their experiences, to showcase that there is no glass ceiling in the trade union for young women to reach the top, and of course to make the change needed in the trade union movement, to make sure that not only the young generations but young women have also a say and a space and perspective in the trade union. The last point, and I'm still on time. Yep, the last point is not so good. Is of course what we were expecting from the Commission, the new Commission to come up with, is of course the dimensions of bringing concrete deliverable in terms of this Commission, this new Commission, when it comes to gender equality. And what we have on the table also. Published ahead of the 8th of March is a roadmap, for which we were, of course, informed ahead of the 8th of March, where we tried to make the Commission understand that the roadmap is nice, but it needs to have something concrete in it. And for the moment, we have little concrete outcome of the whole process. We were able, however, to bring some additional element within this roadmap in comparison to the leak and the draft that we have received, which is, of course, good for us. We just mentioned some of them. The issue of pay transparency, just like that, just to give you a bit of an idea how empty the whole was. The issue of quality care jobs, with the issue of course, gender-based violence, which is not reduced to sexual violence at the workplace. Also interesting to see how the Commission sees that. The zero tolerance for gender-based violence and harassment and bullying in education, very much topical in Europe and unfortunately in France, if you follow the news. And of course, gender-sensitive spatial planning and transport infrastructure, amongst other things. So what we have seen, however, from the Commission is a roadmap which is empty. It's empty. It's nice to have words on paper, but if you don't have actions along those or concrete deliverables, then it's of course much worrying. The only thing that we see, and of course we have alerted the Commission of the process that this roadmap proposes. The roadmap proposes a process by which there is a declaration. So this roadmap is in a way a declaration. Okay, what's new? And a declaration to be signed by stakeholders. And here, why? Who should sign? What is this declaration? Is a compilation of what we have. Is of course a declaration what could be nice to be done, but concretely, how do you see that? So unfortunately, no answer from the Commission in that respect. We understand that it's the roadmap will be an inspiration for somehow the next step, which is also going to be a strategy, okay, to come when? 2025, 2026, a bit late. We already lose a year for action. But what concerns us is, of course, the declarations. If you don't sign it, what does that mean? And we know that the employers have not signed one of the declarations which was very important for us in terms of the renewal of the social dimension, the social policy, and in particular, their engagements toward the implementations of the European Pillar of Social Rights. The LIBE declarations was not signed by Business Europe. So what will be the message if the employers do not sign? What will be the message if some member states like Hungary, for example, does not sign? The Commission had not seen that, and we wonder, should we sign? Because we don't see what we need to see in that declarations. So for the moment, it's a bit kind of an awkward situation by which we were expecting a lot, in particular because we think that the Commission has an opportunity to move on. However, for the moment, we don't see a very rosy perspective. So it does not mean that we will not, move forward. We will certainly move forward. We have our priorities. We might not have the full support of the Commission that we were expecting it, but clearly here, and this is what we will be doing with the Women's Committee and ahead of the midterm conference, where we will also have a dedicated meeting for the issue of gender equality. What do we do? Do we sign these declarations? And if so, with what kind of disclaimer or what kind of condition? And of course, clearly here, what we need to know whether signing or not signing is a clear message. And of course, we don't want to be trapped in a situations by which we would endorse something which will not deliver at the end. So here, a bit of awkward situations. Nevertheless, we are on board and we are very much determined and mobilized. Having the ETUI on our side to make sure that we have the necessary evidence to contradict the employers, amongst others, but of course to incentivize the commissions and stimulate the commissions to move forward. Thanks for the colleagues to organizing this event. Thanks for your support today, in the past and in the future. And of course, I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's loud. Thank you very much, Isabel, for highlighting the very many avenues on which you do excellent work. I think it was really inspiring how broad it is, and to highlight what progress has been made, but also what challenges still remain. And I made some notes here because it really links very nicely to the discussions that will follow, with not all of the aspects you mentioned, but some of them at least being picked up by the researchers and experts that will speak in a moment. For instance, on wages and pay, we have Torsten, who will say quite a lot, and Kalina, who's been very involved in the pay transparency itself, an hypothetical comparator. When it comes to telework and AI and digitalisation, Agnieszka is an expert and will speak on that matter a bit. You mentioned the importance of the women on board, which Sarah will speak on in the second panel, and the excellent work being done on women leaders in trade unions, which Paula, of course, does in a lot of the education department, and Jane is doing research on. So a lot of these things will get touched upon more briefly, but I think I want to thank you very much for just giving this really broad and useful overview of the fight you're still fighting. Thank you so much. Now, Aline will... no. This was a fault of me as a timekeeper, but we will now go straight to the panel, if that's okay.
Perfectly fine. Thank you very much. Since you already introduced a bit the links between what Isabel Schumann said. My name is Aline Hoffmann. I have the pleasure to moderate the first panel. Again, as Wouter said, the point of this event today is to bring together and showcase, indeed, some of the work that we do at the Institute on all of these linked issues. So we've organized it as sort of more of an informal discussion. We have a few questions that I've already agreed with the colleagues to ask. There's a little bit of data, but not too much in some cases. And there definitely will be space for you to discuss with us. Above all, we'd be very interested to hear what you're doing. How does your work and your interest link with what we're presenting here? It's not meant just to be a showcase of what we're doing, but it's an outreach project, I think you can say. So, shall we get started? Then I'd like to start with Wouter. You've worked...
Very festive.
Champagne corks already flying. So Wouter, you've worked on wage inequality and related to that, of course, the gender wage gap. And one part of this whole story is, of course, that women still end up doing different jobs on average than men. Can you expand on that a bit for us, please? What have you found? Yeah.
No, it's to my bulk, I don't have as much space as I should. So thank you very much for that. Indeed, some of my research has been on the gender pay gap and the different aspects of it, and now I'll really focus on this issue of men and women doing different jobs, because I think it's quite important, and sometimes we dismiss it by focusing on what sort of pay gap remains once you're comparing men and women in the same job, which is crucial and really important, and a lot of our legislation and regulation is focused on that. But it's also quite important to realize that if women more often work in lower paid positions and occupations, that's not innocent, that's not neutral. There's something about why would the jobs where women work be paid less, and what pushes people to do lower paid jobs. So I think that's quite an important aspect to discuss as well. So just when we started the gender pay gap, so it's currently at around 12% on average, if you're looking just at the unadjusted hourly pay gap. But of course, this is hugely different between countries. So there is one country in which it's actually flipped, which is Luxembourg, which is an odd case for many reasons. But in all the others, women still earn substantially less than men on average. Belgium's the next one with a very low pay gap. But while it's 12% on average, it goes up to 18% in, for instance, Austria, Latvia, Czechia, or Hungary. So big difference between the EU member states still. And what I won't discuss a lot is that there's still a difference as well in the employment gap. So whether women work at all in the female labor force participation, which is also very different across countries. So when people are looking at these gaps, what they're often trying to do is explain away why women earn less, and then the things that are being explained away because of characteristics, although generally women now are more highly educated, so actually that goes the other way. But they work in sectors that pay less. They often work in workplaces even that pay less within a sector. And I think it's important to note that just understanding what the process is through which there's lower pay doesn't mean that that's explained, that that's then okay. So in some of my work, I've been focusing on that, and then we have to think about what are the drivers of such separation and of women working in these different industries and sectors. And I know Torsten will talk a little bit more about that because he's done some intensive research on this as well, on especially women in the public sector, if I'm. But there are different pathways that lead to that, and some is occupational, educational trajectories and the link to certain jobs. But then the question is, of course, why do women study different things and lead to different jobs? There may also be hiring discrimination, pushing women away from some jobs in the preparation of others. Most importantly, it seems to be about the combination still with the much higher care work that women often have to do. So jobs where this is more easy to do often are also lower paid jobs, and that leads to some of this difference. And then what I also mentioned, beyond this sorting into industry and occupations, there's an increasing strand of research looking at the importance of workplaces. So we know that there's a great difference in what a certain employer pays to otherwise similar people. And increasingly, we are getting aware that women also work into these lower paid workplaces. Some of the reason is because women are generally, this is all on average, right? There's big differences, of course, and there's huge variation there. But on average, women are often less free to choose an employer that is the best match for their jobs, either because they move with a partner or they have care responsibilities. And we even see, if you just look at commuting streams, that they're less able to move further away, to look further away, and that limits the sort of options for finding better employment. So that, from different studies, we see that it's about half of the gender pay gap is due to this sorting, separation into different jobs, different occupations and different sectors. And then, of course, within, this is horizontal segregation is what it's called. There's also vertical segregation where women find it, and then we come closer to actual discrimination and disadvantage, where women find it more, are less likely to be promoted or get into the higher level occupations and are longer kept on a lower occupation. And then, of course, you explain the gap by saying women are in lower paid occupations, but why are they stuck there? So I think it's very important to also focus on that. And then I just want to finish my intervention here with one final thing, which is that we even see some sort of feedback there between, if we look at jobs that are seen as more feminine and where more women work, if you're looking in the longer term over time, you see that actually the pay becomes relatively worse there over time. And this is called feminization. And the negative effects of that on pay, but also on job quality to some extent. And that really seems to have to do, because it differs between countries, that has to do with prejudice, stereotypes, also sometimes changes again in the hours being offered. And there, in some of the research I've done, and one of the papers is outside, we see that there's big differences where it actually, and this is quite important, it isn't as bad everywhere. If you have stronger trade unions, more collective bargaining, more just scrutiny on how pay is set, these sort of disadvantages become less and we become more managed, which is why it's also very important to have an idea of the pay transparency, for instance, and just know how pay is set. The more secrecy there is, the more scope there is for disadvantage and disadvantage. So I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think you've already picked up on several points also that Isabel has raised, and to sort of preview what's coming, we will also be talking about remote work, the skills mismatch, a number of the points. So it was a good way to start. And we'll also be talking about female-dominated sectors. But first, I'd like to go back to the issue of pay and the gender pay gap. And I'd like to ask Torsten, you've been working on the EU Directive on Adequate Minimum Wages from its inception through to its implementation now. Will the Adequate Minimum Wage Directive help in this case? What will it do for women's pay or the pay gap?
Absolutely, and I think probably an even more direct impact than that Pay Transparency Directive. Because first of all, it's one of the key objectives why the minimum wage directive was initiated in the first place, to reduce the gender pay gap. And then, I mean, you have in the minimum wage directive, you have certain criteria and reference values for the setting of minimum wages, and they are all gender neutral, but if the directive is implemented according to those criteria and reference values, we will definitely see an impact. And why we see on this graph,
Do we?
We do.
if we do. And that graph tells you, I don't want to go into great detail, but it tells you two things. The first one is the blue bars are always taller than the green ones, and that shows you that the share of minimum wage earners among female employees is larger than the one among male employees. And even more telling are probably the purple dots, which show you the proportion or the share of minimum wage earners. And there we can see that more in probably only Bulgaria and Malta are the only exceptions. In all the other countries of the EU, more than 50% of the minimum wage earners are women. And it goes up to 2/3 the share in countries like Slovakia, Czechia, Latvia, and even Belgium. So one could say that minimum wage work has a gender, and it's female. And in that respect, the minimum wage directive will definitely have an impact when it is properly implemented in accordance with the reference values, because minimum wages will increase, and that will. This graph shows that the wages, or the minimum wages, in that respect, of female workers will increase considerably. So it will help to reduce the gender pay gap.
So, thank you for that. Now, Wouter, besides doing different jobs, as you pointed out, and as we've seen the impact of minimum wage, you've also done some research on the pay gap between men and women. What can you tell us specifically about that?
So there, indeed, as I said, up to half can be due to men and women doing different jobs, which means the other half is women being paid less, even within the same broad job. Of course, there's some small differences there, but then we're still seeing some aspect being really due to outright discrimination, presumably, but also often, and this is where the pay transparency becomes really important, there is a difference in the ask gap, which is what it's called, with women generally also, it gets a bit more woolly in terms of explanation now, but it seeming to ask for less money. So there's been a very interesting experiment. And this is really what I think is crucial about the pay transparency issue. So there was an experiment on an engineering platform, online platform. It's not ideal for many things, but it was interesting because people had to bid on tasks and say what money they wanted for it. And you could really control, as a researcher, you could see what men and women asked for the same sort of job. And women asked about 3% less than equally qualified men on average. Then there was a sort of glitch in that platform, where all of a sudden a sizable amount of people using the platform didn't have to fill in a blanco box, but the box was pre-filled with a median wage for that sort of job. And the ask gap disappeared because most people just either asked the median or hitched their wage more or less to the median. And then actually, so I'm going to focus mainly on this pay transparency issue because Isabel highlighted how important it is. And I think it's also very crucial to see that the little research that is out there of countries that introduce something on pay transparency, we see that it does affect the gender pay gap and decreases it from between 10 to 20%. Austria is a bit the exception. I don't know what exactly happened there, but there isn't much of an impact in terms of the evaluations, but there also have been only one or two. But so I think that is one important aspect in which regulation can help. And then, of course, the whole battery of anti-discrimination, which is still something we shouldn't lose track of and is still a very important aspect. And I'm going to stop there.
I'm going to throw a question at Kalina, totally unprepared, so it's being lobbed. No, seriously, because you've worked on the Pay Transparency Directive. So for me, it begs the question of, is this what you expected to happen? Are you disappointed or not by how we see it playing out? Is it addressing the right questions?
Yes, so, I mean, of course, the directive could have been better. It could have covered everyone. But again, in the end, I think it was a really good piece of legislation. I think it doesn't cover all employers, but it doesn't only cover large employers, which is great. I think it's also one of the things we wanted to see was potentially a little bit more detail on the kinds of factors that could be used to evaluate the value of work. So to say, the hypothetical comparator is really an amazing innovation, and it was really detailed in the kinds of information that employers are required to produce. And so really, that was really, really valuable, because I was actually going to say there's also been some research in general on the effectiveness of pay transparency measures where they do exist. And I think the evidence shows that when they are more detailed, so, it really is different kinds of information, especially the information that tells you whether there is differences in pay in the same work or work for equal value. When they have a broad scope, so they cover employers. When information is publicly available, so it can be scrutinized, that's where it tends to be more, that's when it tends to be more effective. And so just to come back to what Isabella was saying before about the simplification agenda, they want to take out exactly those features of the directive that make it a really, really important piece of legislation, and they will make it effective. So it feels like, okay, if you take out those things, if you narrow the scope, if you take out the detail, if you take out the hypothetical comparator, what was this whole exercise for? And so that's, I'm really hoping that that directive will be defended, because it is, it's not the best it can be, but it is very good.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we move on, I would like to take another look at the sector aspect. And Thorsten, you've done work on female-dominated sectors, such as the care sector. What does your research tell us about pay discrimination of female-dominated sectors compared to other sectors? So not within, but from the sector level.
I think Wouter explained the economic and maybe even the industrial relations aspects of this discrimination. So next slide, please. I would like to focus on the sociological dimension of the whole thing, because at the very root of the discrimination, the pay discrimination across different sectors, female and male-dominated sectors, is the systematic undervaluation of work done in female-dominated sectors. And a definition could be the systematic lack of recognition, appreciation, and as a consequence, remuneration of tasks and skills as well in typically female-dominated sectors. And I think when we go to the very root, why is this, then we get down to, and that's part of the results of the study I've done for EPSU 6 years ago. That's why the study is not there, unfortunately, on the table. I was told it's out of print, but it has a very easy name. She works hard for the money. So if you go to our website, you can look it up and have a look. So, but the two key aspects from this more sociological point of view and explanation of this pay discrimination is, first of all, and believe it or not, some people think that pay is a reflection of the status of the occupant of the job in society. So that from that perspective, this pay discrimination is a reflection of the inferiority of the status of women in society, in the public perception. And closely linked to this is the second factor, and that's the public perception of the skills involved in female-dominated sectors and occupations. And here, obviously, the care sector is a very good example, because the skills of helping and caring are considered natural skills. Women are by their very nature helping and caring. And in that respect, it doesn't need to be highly valued in the sense, well, compared to acquired skills, because these are natural skills, compared to the acquired skills in male-dominated sectors like manufacturing, for instance. It doesn't need to be valued in the same way, and that's why we see this kind of differences, which are deeply rooted in the public perception and stereotypes which are still persisting in society. And that's why these factors are the most difficult to change. I mean, some things you can change with law, but this is very difficult, because you need to shape or you need to change how work in female-dominated sectors is perceived. And I mean, this quote here is exactly what Wouter said, and I think when we look at sectors or occupations which have been traditionally dominated by men, bank clerks, for instance. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that in my little village in the bank, money was paid out by men, bank clerks. And when more and more women came into the occupation, and what was the result? The result was stagnating or even decreasing wages. And that's linked to this perceptual factors. And that's why I think it's very important that we compare wages not only within the sector, but across sectors. And I think that's one of the big shortcomings of the Pay Transparency Directive, even with the hypothetical comparator. But I think it's very important that we compare wages according to gender-neutral criteria across different sectors. And then we can compare the task and the skills of a nurse, for instance, with an engineer in the manufacturing sector, and then we will see that this is actually quite equal. But it's not equal in terms of pay because there's a huge gap between the nurse and the engineer in the manufacturing sector. But the key factor is we have to come to gender-neutral job evaluation schemes, and that then translates into gender-neutral pay schemes. And I think that's the way forward. For instance, when we talk about responsibility, I mean, obviously in the care sector, this person has a huge responsibility, mainly woman, has a huge responsibility taking care of an elderly person or a sick person or kids, no? But it's still not considered at the same level as an engineer taking care of an expensive machine and operating an expensive machinery, which is still paid a lot more than taking care of this person. So the sense of when we have a gender-neutral category like responsibility, we have to come to gender-neutral interpretation of this. What does it mean, responsibility? And we could define this all the way through. And in the study, which is unfortunately out of print, but still available online, she works hard for the money, you see some examples and some trade union strategies, how this has been tackled through collective bargaining. One way is regulating it, but the other way is collective bargaining, which also plays an important role. And there are some examples of trade unions in some countries, how they tackled it. And I want to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, actually, jumping on what you said, is that's kind of links up to what I said before, that the Pay Transparency Directive, it's not just about pay discrimination and such, but it is also incentivizing the development of gender-neutral classification, sort of gender-neutral evaluation systems and classification systems. And this skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions is one of the, that's sort of put there as an umbrella, but that's why it's so important to develop a more detailed sort of categorizations and sub-factors of what that means, and to make sure that those include skills that are now undervalued because it's assumed that they're not learned skills, which of course they are. So that was just, Pay Transparency Directive, we want to keep it there.
So what I actually wanted to talk to Kalina about in your honored presence is the work that you've done on climate change. So you've used up a lot of your time already because but also I started by giving you pay transparency questions. But I do want to focus on the work that you do on climate change, climate policies, and just transition. And these can also have gendered effects. Can you tell us, will the transition to a carbon neutral economy affect women differently to men? And I'm going to combine the second question with the first. Do you think that the current EU climate and just transition policies adequately take that into account?
Yeah, thank you very much, and sorry for taking up some time, but I wanted to make some few comments on this topic. So thank you very much for this question. What I maybe want to start with is to explain that it's both the direct effects of climate change, so things like extreme weather events like floods and droughts, and also the more gradual climatic changes that we're seeing. So that's the direct effects of climate change, and then also climate change mitigation policy, so what we do on the policy level to address to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So both of those things will have the highest effects on those who are already subject to structural disadvantages. So they will have different effects across factors like gender, but also age, disability status, racial, ethnic background, socioeconomic status, migrant background, and so on. So maybe a little bit like what the previous crisis and the COVID pandemic did as well. And then if we look at women specifically, this policy-driven transition to net zero will have two types of effects, the first of which relates to employment. Now, we know that the sectors that will be phased out, so the fossil fuel industries like coal, oil and gas, but then also carbon-intensive industries like steel that will have to change. So these tend to be male-dominated. So we see here the kind of occupational segregation that we already talked about. So in terms of job losses in those industries, it may be that more men are affected than women. But then it is also women who are underrepresented in jobs that will be key to the green transition. So then the new jobs that will be created are also likely to be male dominated as well. And so that's where there will be employment gains. So like we're talking about renewable energy, for example, we're talking about critical raw material mining and so on. And so there we're also likely to see maybe fewer losses, but also fewer gains. And then women are also somewhat underrepresented in very important fields in the context of the green transition, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, which will also be key, of course, to the digital transition. So, and they're also underrepresented in tertiary education in those fields, and this goes back to the education gap that we talked about and linked to gender stereotypes and so on. And then another factor when it comes to jobs that will be lost and jobs that will be gained is that women tend to be in more precarious positions, and those are the jobs that are likely to go first. And then they also, on the other side, face barriers to access jobs in general because of discrimination, gender stereotypes, but also care responsibilities, and so on. So it's really important to think about how gender intersects with all of these trends that we'll be seeing. And then the other types of effects are distributional effects linked to the energy price increases that will be associated with climate policies like carbon pricing mechanisms, because women on average earn less than men, and so are therefore at slightly higher risk of poverty and social exclusion, and therefore more likely to feel the effects of energy price increases. And here, I think it's really, really important to bear in mind that some women will be much more affected than others because they're subject to additional disadvantages. So, for example, I think a really classic example is single mothers, who are the majority of single parents in the EU, very high risk of poverty and social exclusion. And so for them, this increase in energy prices, which translates both into maybe heating their homes, using appliances, cooking, but also transport, those might constitute a really significant additional burden. And then because the gender gap in pension is also so large, it's around 26% across the EU, means that older women are likely to face a much higher risk of poverty and social exclusion, and also energy and transport poverty. The same counts for women with disabilities, who tend to be on a lower wage, both than women in general, but also than men with disabilities. And so the same goes for migrant women, women from racialized communities, and so on. And so these different characteristics, now I talked about two, but then Mehtap and I, in a research piece that we did last year, which I think you can find outside somewhere. So we looked at how three of these characteristics combined. And then we found, of course, that the combinations deepen vulnerabilities even further. So here you've got, it's already been on there, but this is showing the fact that older women are at older women workers, so these are people in work even, are at higher risk of poverty than older men with disabilities. So this is three factors intersecting. And then the second one, if we can have the next slide, and then the second one shows that younger migrant women are at higher risk of poverty than native-born women, than older migrant women, and slightly more than younger migrant men. So we have here multiple disadvantages combining and intersecting. And the same kind of can translate a little bit into, if we look back at employment, women who are subject to multiple disadvantages in general face reduced access to the labor market and are likely to miss out on the new opportunities that the transition presents. So, for example, it might be the case that older women face a double disadvantage or of gender stereotyping on the basis of gender and age, but also have higher caring responsibilities and so on. And so when we think about inequalities caused inequalities in the context of the green transition, it's really, really important to have a gender lens, but also to have this intersectional lens. And I think one of the things that we found, and maybe some of you have some pointers, suggestions in this respect, is that a lot more research needs to be done, especially when it comes to racial and ethnic background, of which it's not so easy to find data. And then in terms of the policy responses, the other thing that we did together is we looked at some of the instruments that tackle just transition. So we looked at the Just Transition Fund, the Social Climate Fund, some of the relevant recommendations on just transition. We also looked at the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was also very important in this context. And what we found is that some of them, so actually all of them at least mention gender and the fact, this sort of gender dimension of the green transition. Some of them mention some of the other groups, but not all of them. So we found that there's very little on migrants, for example, much less on racialized communities. And then there is very little focus on how they intersect. So again, single women are mentioned, in some cases older women are mentioned, but not so much on the other cumulative vulnerabilities. And often they just mention, I mean, I wouldn't say tokenistic, but I would say it's mentioned in the preamble, in the context, but there isn't really anything very concrete in terms of targeted measures on requirements of member states to have targeted measures in place. And then we also had a look at some of the territorial just transition plans and recovery resilience plans, just to see what's actually happening at the national level as well. And there we see a bit more of a mixed bag. I mean, there were some countries that are really good examples, like Spain. So under both plans, they had very interesting measures in place that look at gender and other characteristics, and also their combination. In some cases, gender is mentioned in most cases again, but not so much the other factors, and not their intersection. And there were very few plans where it's really not mentioned at all. So it sort of reveals this very mixed picture, which I think is telling us that there absolutely hasn't been enough done in terms of concrete and targeted measures to ensure that people who need support the most will also receive it. But we do have some good examples that we should learn from.
Okay, thank you for that. And you've built the bridge already to Mektab's work. Kalina, you mentioned that more work needed to be done, particularly applying different lenses. And Mektab, in your recent work, you've looked at the occupation-education mismatches experienced by immigrant women in particular. Can you tell us something about your findings? What are the drivers of those mismatches?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this bridge, Kalina. I have to first start by saying that when we say mismatch, occupation skills mismatch, so there is two directions where the mismatch can go. It could be, as in the literature, it's called underqualifications. For example, you look at an occupation, you're on a job, and then we see how a person is equipped, qualified, given the task that they are supposed to do. So you might have more complex skills for the job that you're doing, or the other way around. So in this particular work that I would like to a little bit give you a flavor of today is more looking at the overqualification, so the mismatch on the higher end, because this is a more prevalent issue in the labor markets that we observe, and it's even more prevalent among a certain, so in general in the labor market for women, and then immigrant women even worse. So, and if you look at the migration literature in general, we hear a lot about worse labor market outcomes for migrants in general, but if you focus particularly on women, again, this intersectionality, we see that it's actually getting worse and worse. So it's this double penalization, as some people call it. So a little bit of, definitional issues. So the mismatch is on the overqualification, so on the higher end. So think of individuals who have, let's say, tertiary education or higher degrees, but they are working in jobs which does not require those skills. So this is the kind of mismatch that I'm talking about. And then the intersectionality aspect. So as I said, the women are, on average, more likely to be mismatched in their job, and when they're immigrant, this is even more prevalent because of various factors. So in this research, we've looked at 4 or 5 thematic explanatory factors that might be behind these skills mismatches. So the first one is the usual, the social demographic characteristics, so age, educational attainment, marital status, having children or not, and we found the usual stuff. So the more experienced or the older the women are, the mismatch is getting less likely, because perhaps with experience, they maybe find a better job, and so on. And then we've looked at some more, let's say, workplace characteristics as well, and in that, so I'll keep it short, but one of the workplace characteristics that we found very interesting is this trade union membership. So when women are a member of a trade union, actually we see that their overqualification chances are lower. So this is, I don't want to claim causality, but there is clearly a pattern, because this is quite a robust finding that we got over different specifications that we've looked at. And it seems to be that perhaps being more aware about their rights and understanding what's going on in the workplace through union representative might be a way to hinder this kind of mismatches. So it's actually good news for us. And then we've also looked at some more host country characteristics. So where this women work, distinguishing, of course, migrant status and so on. And some of the host country characteristics that we looked at is the overall education and attainment of women in that country and employment rates. And very interestingly, this is also part of the host country characteristic, is the attitude. So we were able to also use some information about attitudes about immigrants. So let me start with the first two, which is more objective measures. So the higher is the female employment rate in a country. We've seen less chances of having a mismatch in that country for immigrant women. And also similarly for educational attainment. So the more educated the overall woman is in that country that we looked at, the chances are lower for mismatches. But then on the attitudes, I don't think you're going to be surprised, but in countries where there's a general negative attitude about immigrants, we actually see more mismatches for immigrant women. So there seems to be perhaps some cultural barrier, perhaps, or discrimination, whatever you call it, that might be at play, that might lead to such outcomes. And I'm just checking whether and I'll stop after that one. This is, again, an interesting control variable we think that is not so common to think of, which is the parental background. So we were also able to check whether, when we were able to measure educational attainment of parents, because we talk about occupation education mismatch, we thought that having the educated parents, whether that plays a role, perhaps by guiding these women in the labor market and so on. And we found that indeed, especially for mothers, having higher educated mother was actually predicting less mismatch for immigrant women in the labor market. So it was this intergenerational transmission of something that seemed to, of course, we shouldn't wait several generations to hopefully get rid of all these mismatches in the labor market, but it was really surprising, and I would say even innovative, to bring in this aspect to explain why do we see this kind of mismatches in the labor market. So I think I'll stop here for now, and happy to discuss.
You've identified a number of correlations, possible causalities, definitely patterns. Let's just leave it at that. The question is, what does that tell us for policy? Are there any lessons in there for policy? What can policy do to address that?
So, some of the things I think are, if I can say it this way, fixable by policy. For example, all those integration policies for immigrant women, their labor market integration, that things that can encourage them to enter the labor force, perhaps childcare policies, language, if it's a barrier, language courses, so all these kind of, let's say, easily fixable kind of or implementable policies. So there are those ones. And then there are the harder ones, which I would say, how do you change attitudes about immigrants? How do you tackle, as Walter also mentioned, we are able to explain quite a bit of things with the things that we can measure. But all the things that we cannot measure, like discrimination, the things that we are not able to, find in the data sets, so how do we tackle those things? That's a harder element that is still there, unfortunately, but there is not really a policy. Or a policy could be there, but how do you, implement or enforce that kind of policy? So yeah, I think that's what I would say. The integration, perhaps one last thing is this facilitation of the skills transferability, because this we see it also a lot in various research when it comes to migrant integration. The home country qualifications are not exactly transferred in a frictionless way to the host country labor market. So there's a bit of skills waste there that is concerning, especially in the context that we are in, where we are talking about, labor shortages, skills shortages. So there's a bunch of people who are highly qualified, but they're not able to practice or use those skills. So I think that's another dimension that we need to keep in mind.
Okay, so I think a lot of what you said fits into the larger mega trend of demographic change. We've done demographic change, we've done climate change, we've done wages. The last mega trend that we haven't addressed yet is digitalization. So Agnieszka, you've done work on various aspects of the future of work and digitalization. particularly looking at remote work. So my first question to you is, are the effects of this seemingly progressive development, are they felt equally by men and women from your research?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the first observation is that indeed digitalization is a mega trend. It's one of the major transitions that we are witnessing, and its speed is unprecedented. So it has, it evolved from being digital technology, from being a tool to perform work. It evolved into something that organizes work. It determines how people work, what they do, where they do it. When we think about the outsourcing and subcontracting that evolves on steroids thanks to digital connectivity. There is a fear that digitalization will replace some of the human labor. So the impact is profound in many areas. I will focus on one particular, which is remote work. But that also involves many different phenomena. So we can talk about telework that happens within the standard employment relationship or within the dependent employment, but also gig platform work or other forms of outsourcing and subcontracting to individuals who can be dispersed and are not workplace bound or are not bound by any employment contract with the entity or the company providing labor. So a lot of debate on technology focuses on how that improves efficiency, how is that an innovation, how is that competitiveness advantage. But to understand what is the impact of technology on society, it's important to first of all acknowledge that it is a certain social context that technology is implemented in, and then the impact of technology, how it unfolds, depends on the social context. So it's shaped and interacts with existing inequalities, biases, gaps, vulnerabilities that we do have in our society. Technology is not overriding the social fabric that it enters. So going back to the remote work, it's not the COVID phenomena. So we wrote a lot. Actually, there is a book. I will also do some advertising. Many of us contributed on remote work. We wrote it during the pandemic when we thought, okay, this is something new. It's really important at this point. But when we look at the number of people who still work from home, it didn't change that much. I think it dropped by 1 or 2 percentage points. The frequency dropped a little bit, but still more than 1 in 5 EU workers employed works from home at least sometimes. So that's a lot. It's a big group of people. In working from home also is mostly telework in European context. So this is the digitally mediated form of labor. Now, the important characteristic of that is that work is brought into the private sphere. So something that used to be performed in the public, in the workplace-based context, is now brought to the private area of the home with all consequences of that and all the historical legacy of private sphere not being regulated or protected almost at all, also including in the European Union. When we think about platform work or the gig work, it's the same phenomena. Most of the policy attention is on the people that we can see on the streets, delivering food, driving people around. The work performed at home by click workers, by micro workers, is completely off the radar. It's not regulated. It's found to have really precarious working conditions, but it stays in this private and invisible sphere for regulation. So on one hand, there can be a positive impact of digitalization that we could expect for gender equality and for working conditions. And I think it's also important to list those. I will focus on just several potential positive aspects, because even if theoretically they are possible, it means that something could be perhaps done or improved or regulated so that they can materialize. So bringing paid and unpaid work into the same location, of course, facilitates reconciliation of those of obligations from those two spheres. They happen in the same place at the same time. People who have care or other obligations at home can more easily join the paid employment sphere. This can help to economically activate women who otherwise would be homebound because of the care responsibilities. There is a scope for challenging the presenteeism culture in the workplace, where a lot of management of the workforce, assessment of the performance was based on really just visual contact. So there is a potential to break with this, and then of course there was a gender balance or bias in the presentation culture enshrined. Then the workplace itself is also a source of many of the gender inequality. So unfair treatment by gender is based on being seen as belonging to one or the other gender, and when the worker is removed from site, we should hope that some of the unequal treatment might disappear. And there's also the expectation of the online environment being gender blind to some extent. So if technology decides on the allocation of tasks, the technology, whatever that is, they don't see the worker, right? So shouldn't decide on characteristics that are then basis for discrimination. Now we know from the research on both platform economy, on remote work, that none of that actually happens. So those positive expectations don't really materialize. And I try to look a bit deeper at job quality outcomes in remote work, so work performed from home through digital technologies, and going in more specific aspects of job quality, also going beyond the compositional effects that were discussed before. So we know that different types of occupations or jobs can be performed from home. So let's assume we compare equal workers, equal with equal, so the similar jobs, workers in similar demographics, and just the difference is that they work from home or not. And on the first slide, we'll see the difference in their working time quality. This is divided also by having children in the household, because of course this is very important characteristic once you work from home. So is the parental status playing a role? It does. So briefly, you can see that the worst outcome is found for the red line on the right. So that's women who have young children at home. They do work from home, usually, so quite often. They should have perhaps the most need, well, they do have the most need for having any flexibility or autonomy in organizing their time, and they are the group that has the least of that. So yeah, they don't really benefit from the fact that flexibility should increase, that the working time is more easily managed by them. And of course, the same group, if we then look at other characteristics, so they stay at home, assumingly they can perform unpaid work at the same time. They burden, so the number of hours they spend on household and care tasks is also the highest from all the other groups. And the conflict, not just the work penetrating their private life, so the difficulty of disconnecting from work, the right to disconnect discourse, it's not just the work penetrates into private, but it's the other way around as well. If they have such a heavy load of unpaid work, that also makes work more difficult. And they suffer the highest family to work conflict. So this particular work-life balance and deprivation. Another aspect we can look at is career opportunities. Being removed from site might not be all that good, so it's not really just easing discrimination, but actually removing the workers from site when there are promotion opportunities, when there are training opportunities on the table, or basically the career progression and development of skills. And to some surprise, we actually see that people who work sometimes from home or usually from home are those with a bit better career prospects. It might go the other way around, that those more trusted and more secure in their positions workers would be also offered to work from home more often. But again, you can see that the group that benefits most, have this premium, are fathers of young children who usually work from home. And if you are familiar with the literature on motherhood penalty and fatherhood premium in terms of wages, this is exactly the same picture. But I'm not including wages here. It is really prospects, which is the prospects for career advancement, using your skills, participating in training on the job provided by the employer. So there is some reproduction of the well-known inequalities. The digital or virtual workplace remains rooted in the reality of gender-segmented and unequal labor markets. And we see that materializing in on many dimensions of job quality and pay. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so you get the same follow-up question that that Mehtab got, which is what does this mean for policy in terms of, or political policy approaches to remote work or working time, digitalization, algorithmic management, we already heard from Isabel Schumann, it is on the table. What from your research can give us concrete leads for what we can fix with policy?
So I gave some of the positive expectations that could inspire perhaps the direction of change. In theory, digitalization or digitally mediated work can have positive effects. So that's where we should put our compass towards. We can only expect the digitalization to increase because it meets both the needs of companies, also the needs of workers. Now also there is sort of a technological race between countries with who is at the forefront of the innovation. So this is something that definitely requires policy attention. And the results of the research and this strong embeddedness of technology in the real life, the very analog social inequalities, just underscores the need to mainstream gender in all sorts of policies that address those new phenomena. So the policy shouldn't be gender blind, as there's an expectation of the technology to be, but gender sensitive. So on one hand, we can look at what happens in the sphere of work, and then the right to disconnect, of course, it's a key development that it's needed to be secure. The separation between paid and unpaid work really needs to be more secure for workers. The way working time is organized and regulated, so this how far we can working time can be divided, the granularity of working hours, the control, autonomy of workers over the working time. In certain contexts, the correct classification of employment status as well, because this remoteness is not just the physical remoteness, but we also prove that it's contractual remoteness increasingly, because if the workforce can be managed remotely, that removes many of the incentives to establish the employment contract, because the control is done through other means. So outsourcing and independent contracting is on the rise. So there is a need to also look at employment status, but at the same time, we really need to look at those underlying inequalities, and then they are very much shaped by the gender division of household, of care work, and gender roles. So here, all the work-life balance, parental leave, policies are of utmost importance that indeed would equalize the involvement of men and women in unpaid work outside of the labor market.
Okay, thank you. That gives us something to think about and work about. Speaking of which, thank you for your patience. We've now had 90 minutes of you listening to a wide variety of voices and covering a lot of ground, from Isabel Schürmann's run through of the 5 main points from ETUC's perspective, what we've heard here about wages, minimum wages, pay gaps, pay transparency, migration, digitalization, etc. Now it's your turn. We would love to hear from you. Any comments, reactions you have to what you've heard. Please also introduce yourselves so we know who you are. And we'd especially like to hear anything where, or any research or work that you're doing that ties directly into this. And we have 2 colleagues that are ready to do the rounds. I would like, in the interest of time, to collect questions first, and then we'll collect. So I see one here. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Doesn't have to be a question, can be a comment or an input. Just, I will continually scan the room, just make yourselves known to me. So please.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So first, thank you for this enlightening conference. I am Luan Belf, and I'm an intern at EPSU. I would like to know if there has been any studies about digitalization and domestic violence, like with women specifically who telework. Does this have an impact on domestic violence?
Thank you for that concise and clear question. Anybody else? Come on. You've listened 90 minutes worth of such a range of things. Surely it's awakened something in someone.
It's one there.
Ah, thank you.
Yes, hello. I will be standing up, then everybody can see me. My name is Jana Giovannis. I actually come from the Belgium permanent representation, so I'm on the council side, often in this setting, the less favorite side. I want to thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have some comments / questions on several things that were raised. First of all, we were discussing the minimum wage directive. I was wondering also, what do you foresee also now and for future initiatives on the case that is now in front of the Court of Justice? That's the first question. Then the second question I had in mind was, you talked also a lot about this comparable employee that is, for instance, in the Transparency Directive. And we also see it coming back now in the Traineeships Directive, which was not mentioned, but is on the table this moment in the Parliament and in the Council. So I was wondering there, if there's some lines that we should maybe already take with us, things that you see while the work on transposition is happening, if you see that there are things that we should watch out for, just some lines in there. And yeah, I thought the discussion and the question from the previous person, was very interesting, because I know EIGE, the Gender Equality Institute, also mentioned it, that they might be interested in some research on remote work and chances that it creates to get a promotion or not. So any more information on that, I would be very interested. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? So we've got 4 topics already on the table, then, yes, Jane?
Oh,
Yes, no.
sorry, that was me. No, it doesn't, I don't think your microphone is, I can't hear anyway.
Just start talking, I think they'll turn it on.
Usually. There we go. Thank you very much, everybody. Fantastic comments. And I just want to ask Helena a question about thinking about the nexus between gender, climate change, and the economic policy emphasis, if you like, and whether there are any examples coming through of just climate and other arrangements that are really stressing non-growth scenarios and well-being, gender, and inclusion, those sorts of things as well, or if these are still relatively pie in the sky. I know certain states tried it. In New Zealand, for example, Ardern had a well-being budget which tried to go that way. I think there was something in Wales that looked at it before that, and also in Bhutan. So if there's any examples and hopefully optimistic sort of movements towards that, it'd be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Okay, we have another request for the floor, please. Yeah, always need an icebreaker.
Okay, I'm Veronica Lemaire of Hasselt University, Belgium. I have 2 questions or suggestions. One is the social protection dimension, gender and social security. As we see that the provision of collective care is diminishing, or there's really a very high gap in what is asked, or the needs, the care needs that are existing in society, and what is offered by the state. And then we see that the care is sent to the families, to the women that take this additional burden, as has been said. So how will we work with that, with this unpaid care load that is increasing on families? And that is also impacting on the social protection rights, as we see in reforms of pensions now in Belgium, that all these unpaid periods are less counted in pensions, but it has effects on all other sides also. Yesterday there was a Belgian conference also on the steep increase of persons getting sick from work, that are in sickness, and that it's mainly women. And that the portion of women in work sickness is increasing very sharply. So that's one. And then another one, which I was developing also here, the question is that how do wage moderation policies, if they are obliged by the state, legally implemented as in Belgium, or not implemented, but informal, or like through pattern bargaining or wage leading by industrial sectors. How does this also suppress the wages of women, the revaluation of women, especially in the care sectors in a very broad meaning, also counting in household services, as we see here also in Belgium, the service, that employers are really, they don't want to raise their wages, even if collective bargaining is increasing, even with a lot of mobilizations of women workers. That's maybe also for the second panel.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's another request back there, and then we'll stop.
Yeah, see if there's more time.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Grace Papa, and I am the political secretary at EFAT. EFAT represents the domestic work sector, and I just wanted to jump in because of the previous comment on the care provision and the lack of accessibility, affordability of care for families, and the burden that women take up above their own job. So, of course, Belgium is one of the good example of good practices where they have created a sector that formalize domestic work for household services. And it has been also largely financed by the government to make it affordable for each and every family. Now, the issue that the colleague is raising is the problem of the salary that stays very, very low, and this is really something that is that's really important. I just wanted to emphasize that when we say that this is a good example, it's because it has recognized domestic work as work, which is not the case of most EU member states. It has regulated it. It has given the same right as any other worker, a decent wage, even if it's very low, and it has professionalized also the workforce. So we at EFAT, of course, we advocate for a duplication of these type of initiatives, but we also have EU strong demands for domestic workers. And I just want to emphasize, yes, I think that's an important topic if we really want to achieve, to close the gender pay gap, if we really want to achieve better work-life balance, if we really want to end violence and harassment in the workplace, we need to tackle the issue of domestic workers. These are 10 million of workers in the EU that are essential to the families and to the individuals in need. So yes, I mean, I'm happy to discuss further, but I just wanted to intervene in that way. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for those inputs. I'm going to sort of try and allocate them here to our experts. So from what I've collected, there's a question for Agnieszka on the link between digitalization and domestic violence, and possibly if you know anything that IGA is planning on doing on that. Then we have the question about wages and collective bargaining with several aspects. One is, Torsten, what is the impact of the current, or what do you think the impact of the current case in front of the ECJ is, or the decision by the ECJ? And then secondly, the question, what impact will wage moderation policies have on the gender pay gap, in particular in the care sector? A very interesting question of what can we learn from the Pay Transparency Directive for the Traineeship Directive? So that's going to Kalina. We've had a bit of inputs on the impact on social protection, social security, and the impact on the overall social protection systems. I'm going to lob that to Wouter. And is there anything in there, Mehtab, that you feel called upon? I know you've done work on social protection as well. Is there something you can add to that? So you have a moment to think about it. We'll take the other ones first. Okay, so Agnieszka, digitalization and domestic violence, or remote work and domestic violence was the question.
Yeah, so it's a very important question, a very important issue. There are several channels when that should be tackled. So one is the fact that the work is performed from home. And of course, there was a lot of research during COVID during lockdowns that indeed there is increase in domestic violence, which is mostly directed against women. So that's one channel, but the other is the digital channel itself, and of course the online harassment, bullying, and all sorts of the violence that happens online is also disproportionately directed at women. So these are those two pathways, and from what I know, in that the digitalization as a channel, the UN Women, they do quite a bit of data collection, and they publish some of the fact sheets on that. In the EU, that would be Aida, and I think Alina knows a bit more. Yeah, do you want to say?
So I think as far as domestic violence and telework is concerned, I mean, I think there have been some studies done, but I unfortunately haven't worked on this for a little bit of time. But I think the issue there is probably strongly linked to whether telework is forced or not, if you have to telework, if it's compulsory telework, because of course for women experiencing domestic violence, the physical workplace away from home is often a safe space. And so if you remove that, then probably I would assume, and my expectation would be that this would be quite an issue. It's also interesting, and I know that Aline will talk about this more, so there will also be another presentation specifically on gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace, but also online. So maybe you'll hear something about it there. But it's also interesting to think about how domestic violence can then spill into the workplace as well. So the effects that domestic violence has on women at home. Of course, then if you're not able to come to work, and you have it's huge stresses at home, and so it's very interesting to think about how those two things interact. And one of the things Agnieszka mentioned is that with the arrival of telework, we also have this blurring of boundaries between the home and private life. And one thing I should say about domestic violence is that one of the reasons why it's been difficult to address it is in fact linked to problems around regulation of the private space. So it was not criminalized for a very long time, and on sometimes something like marital relations, it's sort of that's sort of fine. It's not regulated. We don't interfere. So maybe one of the hopes is that with the regulation of telework, the regulation of the workplace spilling into the home, that will also cast a little bit of light on domestic violence and how that can be prevented a little bit more as well. So that's maybe not quite your question, but still linked to it.
I will just also add, if I may, on the other question on formalization of domestic work. So digitalization also plays a bit of a role here, and the platform economy is one channel for which there's a hope that domestic work, so household tasks and care work will be formalized. But what we are seeing there is that the employer or the employing organization is then not the platform. They still quite efficiently evade any responsibility, and then it's shifted on the households, which in many respects are not satisfactory employer, because it's hard to execute any rights. There is a personal relationship, there is a vulnerability or lack of knowledge on the side of workers when the employer is really another private person and not either the temporary work agency or something like exists in Belgium. So this model is actually very hard to reproduce, and what happens in other countries through the digitalization and digital transition is also leading to many of the risks that are perhaps not realized. And so the employment relationship and classification should be more effectively addressed in the transposition of the Platform Work Directive.
Okay, thank you. Torsten, anyone else want to add something to that complex of topics? No? Okay, then I'm conscious of the time. So Torsten,
Yep.
CJ and wage moderation.
Try to be quick. Minimum wage directive, probably a little bit of background because not everybody might be familiar with the court case at the moment. The minimum wage directive was adopted 2 years ago in autumn 2022, and in January 2023, Denmark, the Danish government or Denmark brought a case to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, arguing that this directive should be annulled. And then there were deliberations, and suddenly, well, not that suddenly, but in January this year, the General Advocate of the European Court of Justice issued an opinion in which he actually agreed with the Danish government that this directive should actually be annulled on the grounds that it unjustifiably interferes in wage setting. So I don't want to go into further detail, just as a background. Now, There is a legal argument to that reply, what I think of it, and there is a political argument to it. The legal argument would be that this opinion is very extreme in its conclusion, that it should be completely annulled. And it's also in stark contrast to all the other legal opinions we got from the legal services of the Parliament, of the Commission and the Council, which came to a different conclusion, that this directive is in line with the EU treaties. And in that respect, we still hope that the Court of Justice does not follow this opinion of the Advocate General, which is not binding, although it carries a lot of weight, obviously, because it's the opinion by the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice, after all. But only in around 70% of the cases, the Court of Justice actually follows the opinion. So we hope that this case belongs to the 30% where it does not follow. However, at the moment, we are still waiting for the judgment, and until the judgment is there, this directive is still in place. So it needs to be transposed into national law. And that also means that the action plans still need to be dealt with. I know that does not really apply to Belgium, but in all the other countries, action plans to promote collective bargaining in countries where coverage is below 80%. So until we have a judgment, it's business as usual. Everything needs to be transposed, and for Belgium, this also means that they should have a look again at the 60% of the median, like the Flemish government did, as a criteria to set minimum wages. So in that respect, business as usual. We hope, as I said, that the court will not follow the government. And now, obviously, the political dimension of it, because, I mean, this directive, I think I'm not exaggerating, but it's the landmark directive in terms of the social dimension and in terms of promoting minimum wages and social conditions of workers in Europe more generally, also because of the collective bargaining dimension of the directive. So if this is taken away now, we might see processes like we've seen in the context of the 2009-2010 financial crisis, where austerity policies and actually policies to freeze minimum wages and to dismantle collective bargaining systems led to very Euro-skeptical views, even in countries where we traditionally have a Euro-positive view. I'm talking about Ireland, I'm talking about Spain, Portugal, Greece. And we might see the same thing, because workers quite justifiably might argue, well, it's not a problem to implement policies from European level that take away, that has detrimental impacts on our wages and our collective bargaining systems. And now suddenly there is something from which we benefit, and now it's a problem. I mean, of course, it's a more difficult legal debate. You can justify the austerity measures because it was a different legal basis, but workers don't engage into these complicated, what they see is, well, something that I benefit from, and at the end of the month is taken away from me. So why should I support this European club if it's only for European business interests? So in that's the political dimension of it, and I think that's could be very detrimental in terms of the whole EU project, integration project, and further social initiatives at European level as well. And in that respect, I also hope that the Court of Justice not only takes a strictly technical legal approach, but also considers the broader political ramifications, because this directive already had very significant positive impact in many countries in terms of minimum wages. People benefited a lot, and if that is taken away, it would be really bad. So that's the answer to that. And then wage moderation, I also try to be brief. Belgium is probably not the best country to discuss wage moderation, because there it has very technical with the wage law, and that you have to take into consideration wage increases in the 3 neighboring countries. But more generally, what we see is that it's kind of an emancipation, I think, of the care sector in particular. Let's take the Nordic countries, where the collective agreement in the manufacturing industry sets the pace for wage increases. And there we have seen, obviously, Nordic countries are also very export-oriented, so we see a kind of a tendency towards wage moderation, not to endanger the competitiveness of their export industry. And that also means that, obviously, public sector and the care sector has to follow this example or this pattern set by the manufacturing industry in terms of wage moderation. However, what we see in the Nordic countries is that in the care sector, the trade unions manage to kind of avoid these kind of wage moderation policies and ask for higher wage increases in the care industry, health for nurses in particular. I'm thinking of the nurses. So I think there is kind of an emancipation. I don't know if this was a one-off 2 years ago in Sweden, but we see a kind of a tendency where developments in the public sectors that say, hey, hold on, I mean, we need really wage increases, we need better working conditions to attract care workers or workers into our sector, and for that we need proper wages and we need higher wage increases than the ones dictated by the export sector. I see a kind of an emancipation. Also, another encouraging sign is that in Germany, for instance, we have seen a lot more industrial action, for instance, in the childcare sector. Which is very unusual because in the childcare sector we have what we call the prisoner of love dilemma, that caretakers in the childcare sector, they don't really want to go on strike because they feel so much responsibility for the kids. They say, well, I do want higher wages, but at the same time, what happens to the kids? So I will not go on strike. But there we've seen a lot more self-confidence of childcare workers saying, no, hold on, our working conditions are unbearable, we have to fight for them. And that's also an encouraging sign, which is against this wage moderation tendency. Furthermore, I also see in the general wage policy, I see a more solidaristic wage policy. Most of the wage demands put forward in the countries where you have sectoral bargaining is based on the fact that they claim lump sum increases from which low-wage workers benefit more than percentage increases. So the demand would be, we want 8% more wages, but at least 300 euros. That's basically the demand the Verdi has in the public sector in Germany at the moment. But I think it's a good example of how trade unions take into consideration wages of low wage sectors, which the care sector actually is one of, in terms of their wage strategy, which is also encouraging and against your wage moderation hypothesis. But I want to leave it at that. I took enough time. Thanks.
Thank you. So I have 3 more questions on my list. So one is the question about what can we learn from the traineeship directive from the pay transparency director, and a question about climate and well-being policies. What other examples do we know from other countries that we can perhaps more easily introduce a gender dimension into just transition?
Thank you very much. I have to say I didn't fully understand the question about, did you mean the hypothetical comparison? Or did you mean comparison in general as between different workers because I'm not familiar with the traineeship directive. So if you just wouldn't mind clarifying, that'd be really helpful.
Yes, sorry that I wasn't clear before. So maybe just quick for the transparency directive. So the idea is that it actually has 2 goals, and one of them is improving the working conditions of trainees. And one of the ways to do it would be that trainees in the same, maybe let's say enterprise, would be compared to each other to see if their working conditions are, let's say, at the same level, but also with maybe the employee that comes closest to them or to their level. So that would be maybe an idea to have in the text. And I was just wondering, based on the experiences we have now from the Pay Transparency Directive, which I understand transpositioning is not always easy, if there are things that we should watch out for instance, with who do you compare best, or are there, like, is it best in one enterprise or multiple, stuff like that. So I don't know if that makes it a bit clearer.
It does. And and thank you so much for this question, because that's a really interesting link in the methods of comparison, because actually comparison in equal pay law is quite a complicated thing. It's like, how do you construct someone who's sufficiently similar, and when are they relevantly different, and what kind of differences are justifiable given the objectives that we're talking about. So I actually think, I'd have to think about it a bit more, but I think from what you say, there is a whole, lots and lots of case law, lots of literature on how to construct a comparator, and that's where also how to construct a hypothetical comparator, because in that case, in that company, there might not be an employee who performs a similar job, but there might have been one in the past, or there might be one within the same consortium of companies. So I think there's probably a lot to learn there, especially what we talked about before. I mean, identifying some kind of objective criteria, like the level of skill, like the level of responsibility, working conditions, which you just mentioned, and so on. So I think it will be really, really interesting to see how some of the methods that are applied in the gender equality context could be used. Of course, they're not, it's not an easy transplantation process, but I think that's a super interesting avenue also for further research to see what can be learned and what can be applied in this new context. And I think it's also, it's also just probably even doing that exercise in itself will show us how unfair it is that trainees are often not getting paid at all or getting paid very little, right? It's like, actually, are you just using young, and not always yet, but generally it's young workers who are entering the labor market. Are you just using them as free labor effectively? So yeah, thanks very much for that question. The other question by Jane, which is on the kind of nexus between gender, climate change, degrowth, post-growth, well-being economy. To be honest, I know that Finland's a really good example. I think that and I think Finland and New Zealand often kind of, smaller countries, but significant ones that have very interesting policies in place. I think they trialed some kind of well-being economy principles across different, I think it was a big initiative by their government to see how that could work. I don't know what's happened with that. I think Finland had a change in government, if I'm not mistaken, as did New Zealand. But I'm very much hoping that's still going ahead. I think Scotland is usually a very nice example, both when it comes to just transition and when it comes to these kind of well-being economy initiatives. So that would be one to look into. I don't know if any of you were there, but a few years ago, there was this Beyond Growth conference. And so I'm sure if you look at some of the materials from that, and in fact, that whole movement and project, there'll be some very interesting examples. There's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is also very active, really, really sort of broad coalition of NGOs and other organizations. Unfortunately, it does seem like after there being so much momentum behind this concept, it now seems to have been replaced by competitiveness, sustainable competitiveness, whatever that means. But yeah, these ideas are very relevant. I actually just wanted to make a very small point. Can I? And that was on, I think you asked such an interesting question as well about, okay, well, what happens to women who go and care for dependents or family members who come out of the labor market. What I wanted to say there is that I've heard recently about some European countries, and I'm sure there are more, and it's another interesting avenue for research, putting in place measures to recognize that time, maybe not necessarily as time, years of employment, but in some ways to recognize the skills acquired. Maureen, correct me, sorry, Maureen, to pick on you, but I think at your conference there was maybe someone from Malta talking about some measures that they've put in place to recognize skills. So they recognize the professional qualifications, maybe time spent on care, whether that's alongside work or not. And another interesting point, I come from Bulgaria, where we have an aging population and very, very bad public sort of healthcare provision, especially for elderly people. So it mostly falls on women. And so what the government has put in place is a system where you can get recognized as the official carer of elderly parents, for example, and then you get training and pay. So my aunt, for example, she works full time, but she also cares for my grandparents, and so she is now recognized as their carer and getting some money from the government. So it will be really interesting to see how that can be worked with a bit more. Sorry about taking space.
No, that's quite all right. Again, that's part of the point of this, is to realize where else can we go, and how does what we've studied so far connect with the real concerns that are out there. So I want to take the last question and then do a final quick round with everybody, so that everybody gets sort of a moment for the last word. And it was this fairly broad question about what is, if I understood it correctly, what is the impact on larger systems of social protection? We've talked about, or you've just contributed part of that answer. You were scribbling and nodding in such a way that I thought you knew exactly what the answer would be. So Wouter, take a stab at answering that question, please.
So I don't have the answer, but I do think it's a really important question. I think Alina highlighted some of it, but it really comes down to this expectation that paid work is kind of the only way, which is a very big debate we're having in Belgium now, where we're of course pushing for this 80% employment rate, and we're not getting there. And the question is why that even should be the goal, because obviously it's not necessarily for everyone. And so I think with the retirement discussions we're having now, that becomes all the more important. And they're scratching a lot of what used to be the equal periods, which is a little bit like what you were saying, where you took care or other reasons for not working, and that was equal for pension, and now we're making that all the more difficult. So I think that is actually a very important point to highlight, because that's where there's this whole debate on the gender inequality in retirement pay, which is very important, and that finds its main bonus and its main origin there. I just wanted to say something as well on the wage moderation issue, because of course in Belgium, like what Torsten also said, we're bound by the moderation of the neighboring countries, and so officially there can't really be pay rises on top of the index, but that's not a pay rise in consecutive years. And what we have in Belgium, therefore, is this huge system of non-pay pay. You get a car, you get checks for this, you get checks for that. And we see this in other countries as well, to a lesser extent. There's different types of variable pay, bonuses, performance pay. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because there's also a very clear gender inequality there. Generally, even when you're comparing similar people, this pay that is much less scrutinized and much less open, which comes to the pay transparency issue, you get much more difference there in terms of who gets it. So who doesn't get it are generally the lower educated, women and migrants. And there you get a relatively big inequality in there. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. And yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks for taking a stab and for adding to the other ones. Mehtab, do you have something to add to any of the points that have been raised?
Yeah,
so far?
exactly. I actually didn't hear any migration mismatch in the question, but I picked up two things that I wanted to comment on. The first one was on this regulation of the domestic cleaning citrus service, as we call it in Belgium sector. One anecdotal evidence, so the work that I talked to you about does not include the recent wave, but one anecdotal evidence was on this cleaning sector in Belgium after the war in Ukraine and all these, people who fled, especially women, they ended up in some countries, including Belgium, in those kind of jobs, and they were much more qualified. At least to start, that was one of the first sectors where we placed those women. So that's one thing that I wanted to comment on. And again, here is a perfect mismatch on occupation and skills. Okay, I'll leave it there. The second point was on the, and that's actually not the work that I presented today, but actually maybe it's time to advertise that kind of work that was done a few years ago on the return to work of those workers who were absent from work for a long time. So we've looked at chronic diseases as a reason. It's actually a project that I started before I joined ETUI, but it ended up being a book while I was there. And we looked at a few countries in the EU. We didn't plan to look at gender-specific issues, but we ended up observing them indeed, that some women are more impacted in this kind of, they suffer more the consequences of being absent from work for a long time. With their career progression, they pay in that respect. Reintegration is much harder for them. And we have a case study also looking at Belgium. If you're interested, happy to guide you towards that study. And just one last thing, Belgium is not one of the worst examples in the countries that we looked at. Actually, it's one of the good examples because there's a system of reintegration in place, this reintegration pathways. But of course, it has its own problems. But it's definitely not the worst case in the countries that we looked at, because it's an important issue. And with the aging population and longer working lives, we're going to have to face with those kind of workers who are absent more and more women, and so on. And it's going to be a bigger issue, I believe, in the coming years. So, but I stop there. Thank you for raising that.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we close for the break, I want to give everybody one last question to end everything on an optimistic note. I think we've spent a lot of time digging into problems and sources of problems. So my question to all of you, each of you in turn, is of all the issues and challenges we've discussed today, what do you think will be the easiest one to fix and why? Wouter.
I think essentially pay transparency, because we're working on it, and getting the wages as equal as possible there and having the information out there, I think is a key thing. It's relatively costless and it has relatively good benefits. And then collective bargaining.
Okay.
Is it most difficult?
Sorry?
Is it most difficult?
No. I just asked for easiest. We're ending on a positive.
As something that we're already doing and that will improve outcomes tremendously.
easiest thing to fix and why?
The green transition.
Easy. I'm not sure. I was actually also going to go for pay transparency just because we already have a lot of tools in place there. We have, I think within the EU, this is the area that we have seen the most activity since the very beginning of the EU. And I think this is one that we really should be doing better on. We've got something good in place. Let's use it. And I'm not going to say anything negative. So there you go.
The easiest one is implementing the European Minimum Wage Directive, I think, regardless of what happens in Luxembourg, because, after all, 24 governments adopted this directive and made a commitment to adequate minimum wages and strong collective bargaining. And what was a good idea 2 years ago cannot suddenly be a bad idea now.
I really don't have the answer for the easiest. It seems like even the telework agreement, as Isabel explained, was a hurdle that was not possible to be mounted. And it seems like something within reach. So let's hope that anything that has AI in its name at least will get attention because of all the hype surrounding that and all the policy and competitiveness attention. So yeah, maybe the area of algorithmic management and the datafication of labor.
I actually prepared the hardest to fix, but okay. In addition to what's been said, I think all those things that was mentioned will also help mismatches to disappear eventually. I would say this getting rid of those frictions in the skills recognition of individuals who come from different backgrounds, or at least facilitating their transferability of their skills would be a good way to go. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, dear colleagues, for having engaged in this sometimes a bit unpredictable round. It's not the same as having a presentation, giving it and walking away, so thank you for that. Thank you for your interest in the topics. We now have a 25-minute break. I don't want to punish the later panels for the fact that we went 5 minutes over, so plenty of things to talk about over the coffee break, and we resume back here at 4 o'clock. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Aline.
Now? Can you hear me now? That's because I hadn't turned the on button on, so that was very good. So I hope that everyone's had a coffee. It's getting a bit later in the afternoon, so I hope that's going to keep you to stay awake because we have another really, really interesting panel to go. And whereas the first panel focused a little bit more on labor market trends, transitions, sort of maybe in some ways the bigger picture, what we really, really want to focus on a little bit more is the workplace. So we want to talk about women's working condition of the workplace. We want to talk about the ways in which we can empower them, the ways in which they can participate in shaping their working conditions, and so on. But what we really wanted to start with first is to give space to a really, really fantastic initiative by the ETUI on the important topic that we already touched on a bit, but we'll hear about more, which is on gender-based violence and harassment at work. And they've had this really amazing project called Safe at Work, Safe at Home, Safe Online, which has really been supposed to come forward with practical steps on how this can be addressed at the workplace through appropriate workplace policies. And here to present it with us is Aline Brüser, who is the policy advisor on gender equality at the ETUI and who also coordinates the Women's Committee. So she's really, really involved in all of ETUI's work on gender, which is a lot, as we heard from Isabel, and she's the person who makes it happen. So thank you very much, Aline. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kalina, and thank you so much for the ETUI for having me at this very timely conference just after the 8th of March, of course. Very great to be at the demo on Saturday. Maybe some of you were there as well. It's a day of struggle and of fight, and I think that's what trade unionists do best normally. So I'm very happy to be here. Maybe allow me just to say very few words on the previous panel, which was very, very interesting and very insightful. So obviously, I mean, Isabel said it also that the Pay Transparency Directive is currently under attack. We will do, I mean, we have seen this directive through, in fairness, the ETUI and its Women's Committee with the support of ETUI, of course, and we'll do everything we ever can to make sure that Business Europe is not, I don't know if we have employers in the room here, like happy to hear from you also, but we will do everything we can to make sure that this directive is not going to be watered down, which is also from a democratic point of view, like this is an adopted directive, so it's in place, and we will make sure it stays intact. So now I'm very happy to speak about this project, Safe at Work, Safe at Home, Safe Online. We had a great question previously by the colleague from EPSU about domestic violence and telework, and that was literally actually why we started this project. I'm trying to, yes. I will not go through the report and to the guide in detail. You will find it you will find hard copies outside. So basically my main aim here is, to increase your motivation in reading it. So I will give you a few points about this project. So basically we have a report and a guide. And what did we want to do with this project? Sorry, this thing. Okay, perfect. So the project was really born kind of during the COVID pandemic. Because we were wondering, everyone was speaking about COVID, we already touched about the question of telework. And our main finding was first kind of a felt increase, let's say, in third-party violence, because we know that many women workers, many of those essential workers, so people actually who cannot do telework, but who show up outside, like in, at their workspaces outside the home every day, and they did that during the COVID pandemic as well. And then we had the situation, where a women worker had, for example, in retail, they had to remind someone to wear a mask because it was, the sanitary measures were in place. And then we had we were under the impression that we have to have a closer look at third-party violence in particular. But not only, and that's again coming back to the question from the colleague before. What happens if I am in telework and if I am a victim/survivor of intimate partner violence? And then I'm exposed to that person during my working time. So, when the work shifts to the home, that is technically a very, very unsafe place for me as a woman. And then the other new form, we call this sometimes new form, obviously, maybe that doesn't really hold, but what about cyber violence? What about AI management? What about basically all the shifts we see in the world of work, and what kind of effect does this have on gender-based violence? Can we speak about new forms or old forms? People might say sexual harassment is kind of, a form of gender-based violence that everyone would recognize is a topic for the world of work, but we wanted to see what forms of gender-based violence are there, what kind of are the conducive elements for these forms, and in particular what trade unions are doing to address these forms of gender-based violence. Next slide is not coming. Is it? Where is this thing? There? Okay. Very good. So just again a short overview. So here's a list of forms of gender-based violence we are looking at we have looked at in this project: sexual harassment, domestic violence, third-party violence, cyber violence, and also a very new frontier, let's say maybe for trade unions, gender bias and algorithmic worker management and digital surveillance. Digital surveillance being also one of these issues where we've heard from women workers, if I'm in telework, who actually manipulates the camera on my little laptop? Has an employer actually means of putting that camera on while I'm teleworking? And just to say, the world of work is patriarchy is everywhere, and it's very much in the fabric of the world of work as well. So we just have to be very, very vigilant and really see kind of what opens the door of forms of gender-based violence. So what did we look at? We looked at legislation, because this project was also kind of accompanying our work on the draft, at the time, the draft directive combating violence against women and domestic violence. As many of you might know, this directive is now adopted. It's also in place. I have some thoughts on that directive, maybe for later. But we wanted to see, okay, what do we need? What do we have in terms of legislation in EU member states? What are trade unions doing to combat these forms of gender-based violence? And then in consequence, what are the policy recommendations, or what can we give also our affiliates once we have gotten their input on what they're doing? How should we move ahead actually to make sure that all workplaces are safe spaces? So I won't go maybe through everything in detail. I just would like to really underline one thing, because we're all following the news. We all see how governments are increasingly changing their priorities when it comes to public money and where this money is spent. And I'd really like to mention that everywhere where we have staff shortages, where people are under pressure, and here I'm specifically maybe also referring to the public sector, that is a conducive element to gender-based violence. And third-party violence is a bit of a no-brainer, meaning if, let's have a nurse in a hospital and that nurse is in a situation where she is, that the hospital is understaffed, let's say, so that person cannot give as much attention as she might want to a patient, and then in consequence, we just see how third-party violence increases, meaning patients or people in the hospital get angry and would insult that person, right? So I think it's really, what I really would like to underline is that like a well-funded and well-staffed public sector is a bit of a firewall against, in particularly third-party violence. We have, in general, a problem with data. Here I might give a shout out to EIGE, because EIGE has last week or at the end of February, I think, done actually a new report on gender-based violence with new figures. Why is that important? Because everyone, including the ETUC, we have made reference to data from 2014. So that's now 10 years ago from the Fundamental Rights Agency. So that's a bit the issue. Like we have, there is a lack of data, and there is a problem of understanding the prevalence of this problem, knowing that, of course, it's not easy also for survivors to report. It's not easy, to being in a safer space that allows me to report an incidence of gender-based violence in my workplace. And we all know why, because I might not be taken seriously, because I might fear economic consequences and so on. So that also plays into the problem, kind of. Now, what are we doing? I think the good message here, the first message is like we do address all forms of gender-based violence that I had previously mentioned, maybe slightly with the exception of cyber violence, because this is really new. And you might want to ask also, like, why is cyber violence such an issue? And the one example we always quote is a bit what we heard from the Italian affiliates once, because, for example, you had a woman working in childcare, and that person was a victim of image-based sexual abuse, which is basically another term for revenge porn. And what happened next is that woman was fired, right? Because you had like parents, or you had the employer saying, "Oh, you can't work with children. Like there's like revenge porn of you on the internet, manipulated material often, with the help of AI and so on, deep fakes." So we have, again, real economic consequences on survivors of gender-based violence. So I think cyber violence is really something we have to address more. I've heard also from a Finnish colleague recently that we have more and more, and people who are on Instagram or TikTok might know this, like we have these kind of prank videos, right? So if you are a women worker working in retail, if you are in a shop or wherever, then people come in and just ask you weird questions and film you, and they put it on Instagram. Like, this is not a safe workplace. I didn't want to be on Instagram or on TikTok, and I didn't want to be ridiculed in a TikTok video. So what is an employer, this is the duty of care of an employer also extends to this, right? And an employer might say something else, but that's at least what we are saying. And again, like on the topic of cyber violence, I think we have to get, it's new, we have to get better. On the topic of domestic violence, I think unions are doing really important things, in particular when it comes to collective bargaining. But also, again, coming back to the question, I think we still have to see a bit more how this interacts with telework. Because again, the duty of care of an employer, I think that's not the question. Like also keeping in mind maybe ILO Convention C190, a person is paid for in the, like the duty of care of an employer would naturally extend if the workplace is the home. But how this exactly, how unions can make sure, in particular also occupational safety and health structures can make sure that the home as the workplace is safe. I think that's something we will do more work on. But on domestic violence in general, and Kalina mentioned that before, a very, very important dimension is that it can be a safe space for a survivor of domestic violence. And if employers play their part, and unions as well, it will be a safe space also. And the measures put in place are, for example, relocation, to put a survivor of domestic violence would then temporarily work somewhere else, because often violent partners know exactly, of course, where the victim works, so they would show up at work, they would intimidate that person at work. So we really have to make sure that a victim survivor of domestic violence can go to work safely, can be at work safely, that the employer is informed, and that there are measures in place. Paid leave is also one means of choice that many employers are actually doing. And my main point is that, so we are doing something on this, and then sometimes they hear from the employers, but what should I do about domestic violence? That's something in the private space of the victim. It's not. And also coming back, I think we all have to orient ourselves in the left in general, like on bread and butter issues. Financial dependence is toxic, right? It's toxic for everyone who is already confronted with domestic violence. So it's really for unions, it must be a key issue to make sure a woman worker can earn her money, can be safe at work, wherever she works. And that's really, that's a means of actually being able to escape a violent relationship and a situation of domestic violence. So policy recommendations, as said, I think we really must in many member states work more on having like robust legal provisions in place that recognize all forms of gender-based violence and their spillover effect to the world of work. Again, not only sexual harassment, I'm getting a bit tired of hearing that, and I hear that from the Commission also. Sexual harassment is always singled out as that one form of gender-based violence relevant to the world of work. We have proven it's not. Domestic violence, as just said, spills over, cyber violence, third-party violence, and so on. So we really must make sure that we have robust legal protections in place. And also, trade unions have to do their part as well. And I'm not going to hide that from you, that I think provisions making workplaces safer might not be the highest point on the agenda for many unions. As you know, like collective bargaining routes is still a bit like the holy grail of trade union activity, and bringing in, like, okay, we have to negotiate on this point and this point only now, might be a tricky thing to do. So I think we have to do, we have to get a bit better at this as well. But still, now this thing strikes again. I respect strike. Okay. So just to say that in the report you might find, of course, collective bargaining agreements, and I think this is a very interesting one. This is a French one, where actually in the collective bargaining agreement it's also provided that kind of the employer teams up with an NGO who works with survivors of domestic violence, and I find that very, very interesting, because NGOs are not social partners. That's something that we as unions say a lot, and it's true. However, if you have a frontline service that really has the knowledge and the expertise in working with survivors of domestic violence, that might be really beneficial, because in fairness, unions sometimes don't have it, right? So my works council or my health and safety representative might not have received that training to really be able to accompany and support a survivor of domestic violence. So let's just team up with the people who have, right? So I think that's actually a really good example. We have included also a little checklist for our affiliates, to check where to start also, because it can get a bit overwhelming at time. I will not go through it, but again, like, just if you want to get a copy outside, please help yourself. And then, obviously when it comes to sexual harassment, and I'm closing very soon, code of conduct are a means of choice. The ETUC has a code of conduct in place. I think it's very, very important that everyone who steps into our offices or into our meetings is aware that there is a zero tolerance regarding sexual harassment or any form of gender-based violence and harassment. And needless to say, just words on paper won't do it, so we need like clear policies set out. A person needs to know, a potential victim needs to know, who do I address this to, who do I speak to, what's the procedure in place. So just also to say, code of conduct work. Now, I have stolen this from the comrades from CGT and FGTB, I must say, because I think they came up with it. So that's our violentometer. It's a bit of that's a bit of a communications action, I must say, but it might be interesting. Many people like this a lot, and I do too, because I think what's also important to note is that sexual harassment or gender-based violence and harassment at work never starts nowhere, right? So yeah, it's a bit to visualize the continuum and the fertile ground that exists for gender-based violence or harassment to flourish, kind of. So obviously we have like we have the green that goes into the yellow, that goes into the orange, and that goes into the red. So I think it's really important for us unions also to continue to raise awareness. That's one of the main finding of the study also, is that many unions are very, very good in raising awareness. We have to get better in bringing it into our collective bargaining agreements, of course. But I think really to put this on the top of the agenda, this issue, is really, really important, and these tools can certainly help. About the next steps, and I will close soon and not steal time from the panel that comes after me. So again, very briefly, maybe for unions, the directive combating violence and domestic violence is not delivering as much as we would have liked it to deliver. There are many things wrong with this directive. Obviously, there is no criminalization of rape defined based on lack of consent. That's one thing that's wrong with the directive. But unfortunately, we have 0 to none provisions that actually would help in making workplaces safer. We have a mention of sexual harassment and specialized services to deal with sexual harassment. That's really, really far away from what we would have wanted in that directive. I think many of you know here how hard this, the people in the European Parliament, for example, and also the Council, how hard this battle was to get this directive over the line. I think what's really good in this directive, however, is that forms of cyber violence are criminalized. I think that's really something new and something that might be really, really helpful. So we will see what we can do with this directive. Again, just managing expectations, not so much, but we still work on this, of course. Ratification of ILO C190 is still super timely. We still have many European member states who haven't ratified nor implemented, obviously, the convention, so that's very important. We see from the Commission what comes up in terms of preventing psychosocial risks. So basically our plan now is to see what comes out of the Commission, what kind of proposals they will publish, and get basically the dimension of gender-based violence and the fight against gender-based violence in wherever we can. The same goes with AI in the workplace. Unlikely that there's going to be a directive, but one can hope. Then very important, and Isabel mentioned the framework agreement on violence and harassment at work. Let's sit down with the employers. The ETUI is just preparing the draft work program for social dialogue, and we have mentioned this as a top priority. So I would be very happy to negotiate it with the employers, how we can update this agreement and include domestic violence, cyber violence, and third-party violence. Watch this space. Then obviously we will continue to share collective bargaining, and because collective bargaining obviously is the means of choice for us unions. So we will continue to work with the Women's Committee on sharing good practices. Further raise awareness. And again, I can't say it enough, this is a bread and butter issue, and this has, gender-based violence has severe economic consequences for women workers. And I think, if we have to get everyone behind this, that would already help, right? And I think we would like to work also a bit more on everything pertaining to economic violence, which is a bit of a fluffy term at the moment, but we have to just find a way to make people understand that this is not a woke issue. This is not about woke feminism. This is about me being able to earn my money, to be financially independent from my partner, and to be just safe and have my human rights literally respected. So, and then the cherry on the top is the roadmap. Isabel mentioned the roadmap that came out 3 days ago, and this roadmap. Isabel said it all. It's a bit random, and we are a bit reluctant to engage with it at this point. But I would like to say that thanks to our consultation, we have obviously the Commission has organized a consultation. We have sent written comments and so forth. So we have at least the mention now, the wording of eliminating gender-based violence and sexual harassment in the world of work. So here are 3 elements. First of all, it's not only sexual harassment. Well done, European Commission. Not only sexual harassment, we have the wording world of work, which is also based on the ILO C190, which is really good. So let's see what we can do with this. Not so much, of course, but at least we have made sure that the Commission maybe will also, adopt a bit of a comprehensive reading of what gender-based violence is and how it spills over into the world of work. Sorry, I was very long. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good. Thank you so much, Aline. I think you're doing really fantastic work. Really impressive. This project has been really remarkable, and I think it'll be very useful. Will you be able to stay in the room so maybe people can ask you questions at the end of this panel? Would that be okay? Okay. Thank you so much. As you want. You can stay there. Yes. Thank you so much. Then let's begin with the second panel.
All right, thank you very much, colleagues. Can you hear me also in the back? Great. Thank you very much to begin with, Aline, very interesting. I missed the beginning of your talk. I was unfortunately in other meetings, but this is one of the topics where I believe the ETUI and the ETUC really work very closely together. We reinforce, I hope, and stimulate sometimes the ETUC with regard to their work and our work on gender equality. And so the fact that you're staying onto the panel also to discuss with us is really a sign of that. So that's a great start. So we now move on to the second panel about empowering women at the workplace. Again, a fascinating well, let's say mixed panel, in the sense that, so Sonia, who will start in a moment, is a researcher in Unit 3, working on health and safety issues. Paula is working in the education department. I'm also happy that my colleague Fabio Gelfi is with us here today. Good to see you, Fabio, again. Sarah will continue to speak then. She's working in Unit 1 on Europeanization of industrial relations, and then Jane is researcher in the Foresight unit. So I'm very happy. So we have the whole institute here in this, also in this second panel, from the different departments, the different units. And I think it says something about how serious we take gender equality in our workplace, even though I will at the end say, be a little bit self-critical on that aspect as well. Okay, so let's just dive in. Sonia, you have the floor. So normally each of the speakers have 5 minutes, but I've been told by your fellow panelists that you have very important things to say and that you therefore deserve 6 minutes. So please, the floor is yours, Sonia.
Thank you. Kalina mentioned 7 minutes, so I will try to be brief, but I do have a very important role here to represent research that is being done by my whole unit of health and safety and working conditions. Therefore, I might speak for a little longer. Thank you for the first panel. Very interesting research and aspects that had been mentioned that do give a bit of context to what I'm going to talk about, which is occupational health and safety and a gender dimension in it. And to start with, I wanted to mention that we have to differentiate two different things here, the sex and the biological differences, and the gender, which is more a society aspect of it. So regarding the sex, we need to acknowledge that women are not small men. And we do have different physiology. We do have a different center body of mass and hormonal infused physiology. Not only between men and women, but also between women, depending on the age they are in. And that is one of the aspects that is making the things very complicated for us in the world of work, because not only we historically we were kind of told to fit in to the work conditions and the workplace design that was for men, a lot of the issues that we have in the workplaces has remained invisible. it kind of brings the question of how to talk about it and how to raise awareness in that aspect. And the other thing that I want to talk about is the gender and the social norms that kind of were mentioned a bit earlier in the second panel, in the first panel as well, which were the segregation, occupational segregation and sectorial segregation, but also the invisible work that women are doing at home and caring for their family and for children. So how does this context has an impact on occupational health and safety? Or there are two aspects of it. One of it I mentioned already was this differentiation in the invisible and visible risks. So women usually work in the sectors where the risks are not visible, such as workplace home balance, such as the harassment and violence, such as the physical, psychosocial risks in general, which were mentioned by Isabel in the morning, whereas men work in the more physical, demanding sectors where the risks are visible, because if something falls or breaks, there is usually a physical damage to their body and it's being recognized and is being seen. And the other aspect is the exposure to psychosocial risks and the other risks in general. For example, in our research unit, we have a researcher, Marwan, who's doing work on the climate change and the green transition, and he is working a lot on the impact of these transitions on occupational health and safety. And there is a big difference in how women and men actually respond to heat stress, and what are the limit values, for example, that should be recognized for men and women. And again, there is this intersectionality for women regarding the age, because we do have a different hormonal physiology depending on the age we are, depending on the time of on the menstrual cycle we are, for example. So it does bring a lot of complexity, and I'm not gonna lie, it does make it complex to acknowledge the occupational health and safety differences for men and women, and to focus on that aspect for women. But we can't ignore it. It's half of the population, working population, and we need to be very vocal about it in the research and in social policies. I don't know how much time I have left.
You have 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes, fantastic. So I'm just going to talk right now about a bit about the barriers that we acknowledge when we're talking about the prevention and protection of occupational health and safety and the gender impact of it. So I was talking a little bit about lack of research. First about the funding for the research for the occupational risks for women, and the historical prevalence of looking at the risks in a male-dominated sectors makes a difference in what we know. So we know much more about the risks, physical risks, and we know much more about how male body responds to those risks rather than what happens for women. And the second aspect is societal lack of awareness, and also the fact that there is this invisible risk for women that is more prevalent, makes it less likely to talk about it. Somehow it makes it more taboo. And we don't talk about it. We feel as women very isolated, and because of that, it is more difficult to make change in those aspects. And two more things in the barriers that I have written is the training and lack of personal protective equipment for women, but also in general, the workplace is designed for male ergonomics and male bodies. So there have been studies, very interesting studies that has been done in how women, for example, are less efficient and slower in certain tasks that are dominated by male, but if they're given ergonomic tools or if the workplace is designed for their bodies, they are actually more efficient and faster. And I'm gonna wrap up, but I'm just gonna say two more sentences. We don't have the publications that are being displayed in a room outside, but if you go online, there is a very extensive research and publications that has been published 4 years ago. For example, there has been a big report on gender and working conditions and health. It is a fantastic work that was also inspired by the conference that we had on gender and OSH. And this year, actually last year, December, we again had a OSH gender conference that was very inspiring. And we talked a lot about things that I mentioned here very briefly, but the recordings of the conference are on our website and the presentations are on our website. And most likely, my research, our unit will follow up on certain topics that had been mentioned in that conference. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sonia, for that performance, I must say. So presenting in, well, a few minutes' time, the work of your entire unit. Some of the colleagues are also here in the room, and illustrating how you integrate the gender dimension in occupational health and safety research and the challenges that you face while doing that. I've written down the difference, the importance of distinguishing between sex and gender, and that women are not small men as well. May I just, because that for me was an very interesting moment, you organized the OSH annual conference in December, where our new head of unit, Demi Theodori, your head of unit, took the floor and said, now we're going to talk about the fact that women, most women, bleed once a month. We were with 100 people in the room, and I can say that especially the guys in the room, including myself, were like, whoa, what is this? And we had a fantastic panel, I must say, about about the impact on the work floor, on women's well-being, etc., of periods of menopause. All of these topics were, in all honesty, most male managers like myself prefer not to talk about. So thank you for that kind of eye-openers, which we need on a regular basis. Now we're going to talk, we're going to move to the education department. So Parla, you work in our education department, and of course we would like to hear from you in about 6 minutes, if possible, how important is education and all the activities that you undertake for initiating conversations, notably with trade union representatives, about gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. And thank you, Sonia, for the presentation. I think we have been introducing ourselves in different ways, and you were saying about ETUI that we like to stimulate also the ETUC and other actors. And in the education department, we always introduce our trainings saying that we are there to support, to strengthen and stimulate the trade union movement. And in this regard, in the gender equality topic, we really think this is a priority. It's a priority for trade unions. It's a priority to to be and to express the democracy inside the trade union movement and inside the representation of the workers. So it is very important for us to first mainstream the topic in the different subjects and in the different workshops, training courses, events that we organize, but it's also very important to have specific dedicated training courses to empower, to make the point and to highlight the relevance of the topic for all kind of workers. So for us, the courses, the trade union education is at the same time, part of a big strategy. And sometimes education is also used as a tool. So it's also a tool to support and to create awareness and to open conversations and to start reflecting on something, a change in a legal framework, or a new law that we just have, and we have to start implementing trade union actions. So we focus in different levels, but of course, when we talk about trade union education and we speak directly to trade union educators, we create a few years ago a tool to start opening a conversation inside the trade unions. And the idea was to reflect about our practices as trainers, as educators, to reflect and to see if we were aware of the difference and the importance of gender equality in the education, but also to reflect on our organizations. So what's happening in our organizations? Do we have a gender equality plan, or do we have specific measures to incorporate and mainstream gender equality, or maybe to transform our organizations, going beyond the mainstreaming, beyond mainstreaming the gender equality? And we have like a short survey. Well, I want to call it short. It's 29 questions. The three first questions is just to reflect about our self-perception. Then we ask the participants about the organization, also to analyze the leadership in their organizations. If they have any kind of measures in place to promote gender equality. Then we go and ask about specific gender equality training courses, seminar initiatives in training. And then we assess ourselves as trainers, not only our self-perception. So it's a useful tool that can be used as an excuse to open a conversation in the organizations, in small departments, in small groups, and then go up in the different places of the organizations, and to start implementing, and at the same time evaluate if you are making some progress in the achievement of gender equality. Perhaps you saw some cubes on that table outside. Here you have a QR code for the tool, the self-awareness and self-reflection on gender equality. The idea is to start reflecting, but to act. And it's the same methodology that we use, for example, in the training courses at the ETUI. So we are there, we are talking about a very important issue. For example, if we talk about sexual harassment, we go with the best experts that we can have there to explain very well the topic, also the impact on women, but at the same time what we want to achieve after the training course is that people goes out with a specific plan, something like a kind of a big commitment that they will start implementing in their workplaces to transform. The idea is to reflect, then to think what I am going to do, and then to transform our places.
Anna, thank you. No, not yet. Too quickly. I had a very quick follow-up question. Well, you can applaud whenever you want, of course. Go ahead, applaud. Yes. No, because you mentioned empowering women at the workplace, including trade union representatives, women leaders. So I'm just curious, you know, as a non-trainer, as a non-educational expert, can you give us maybe a very concrete example of what kind of challenges you face as a trainer or as trainers when you try to have this kind of conversation with trade unions about empowerment, women's empowerment?
We always have the resistances when you want to introduce something that is going to change the status quo. You always have a big resistance, and you always have backlash inside the training room, inside the events. So you will always have this kind of reactions. You have to be prepared to respond in a nice way, but also with the security and the confidence that you are introducing something that is fair, it is creating social justice. So it's something that is very, very important.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Excellent. Yes. Thank you very much. And we'll have time for more questions afterwards. So, Sarah, your turn. Sarah is, as I said, working in Unit 1. Now, some of you may know, most of you may know that after, I think, about a decade of stalemate, we now have finally a directive that I only knew as the Women on Boards Directive, but now I have the full name here. It's a Gender Balance on Corporate Boards Directive. It's finally there after a decade of stalemate and negotiations. So, question to you, is this something important? Is it significant? Is it symbolic politics? And what difference can it make for the trade union movement? Please, Sarah.
Okay, I was not sure if, thank you, Bart, if a question was coming or not. But in any case, I think this topic links very, very well with what Paula just presented, actually, because you were speaking about the backlashes and how difficult it is to treat this issue of gender equality within the union movement itself and the events and trainings you organize. And here, actually, what we have is some development at the policy level, which contributes also to, or make it easier, perhaps, for us to address the topic from the ETUI at a research level as well, because it's via this directive that we can look at some issues that also affect work. So we may think that corporate boards are very distant from the workplace and from the work floor, and some of the very relevant key topics that were discussed already, violence, harassment, pay transparency, and the like. But in fact, this directive actually wants to address, first of all, the inequality in power positions at the economic level, which I think is quite relevant and affects the whole hierarchy and world of work in general. Also, it's corporate boards that are taking key decisions that do affect working conditions, that do affect policies in general, human resources promotion policies as well within corporations. And it sort of, reflects it's like a sort of peak of iceberg of all the discriminations we may have in the world of work. So voila, so as you said, Bart, the final adoption of this directive in 2022 is a clear mark, I mean, a step forward in reaching, well, a bit more equality, right, or at least this symbolic step forward on that regard. Now, of course, it is quite recent, and the transposition of this directive, I will explain a bit perhaps superficially, but what this directive is meant to contribute to.
but the transposition was supposed to happen now at the end of 2024 in December. So it's still a bit earlier to really know what this directive has brought in terms of transposition. Not all the member states have transposed yet. And it's precisely one of the angles we want to look at in our next work program at the ETUI, is to see what member states did with the transposition and how it can in this way affect or not unions, more or less directly. I will explain why. So basically what this directive intends is to force member states to create some binding, or to ensure that listed companies, at least, which is already a restricted scope, but that listed companies pursue some objectives and reach them by mid-2026. It's objectives in terms of quota and representation of, in the directive, we said the underrepresented sex, which of course we all know is always women presence in the boards, but how the directive phrases it is the underrepresented sex should be represented in 40% of the, in non-executive director positions, or else in 33, so 1/3% in executive positions. So that are the objectives. Now, the directive goes a bit more in detail, providing for the means to achieve those objectives, and I think that was the most critical aspect of the directive, because it goes into really establishing some rules, binding rules, that talked about preference rule, for instance, whenever there are two equal candidates, well, the underrepresented sex should be appointed, should have preference, and that of course still freaks out not only within the unions. I mean, it's a question of positive discrimination, right? So it's and also touching to, well, how the selection process is formulated, how the vacancies are formulated in neutral terms, so that no discrimination is included. So that was the main point of this directive, I think, but also foreseeing penalties, so asking member states to establish effective penalties, which can range from fines to the annulment of nominations for board members, for instance, so it may depend. But now an interesting question, and I guess that's why the directive was adopted, is that there is a suspension clause for those member states that were more advanced in trying to reach or to improve the representation of women in their boards. Then this suspension clause would allow them not to establish these rules in terms of positive discrimination and so on. So, I mean, it's still to be seen which member states will actually go and will be bound by these rules, right? But I mean, I guess in general terms, I think it's a good news that this directive was passed, because for sure, and ETUI has not been looking in my units on industrial relations, we haven't been looking systematically at issues of gender inequality, but we were always interested in, and if you look at different benchmarkings in the past, we touched upon this issue in different publications already. And what was obvious from there is the fact that, I mean, not one single member state reaches equality. So if we let it to voluntary measures and we don't regulate on this, then change is not happening, at least not as fast as it could, of course. And well, here we can say from data from the European Institute of Gender Inequality, which has the data at disposal, from 2024, we have only France, Sweden, and the Netherlands that reach the 40% that the directive is attempting to reach in terms of, well, female or underrepresented sex, female members in boards. So this is, of course, very little, and there's still a lot to do ahead. Now, of course, the directive is 2 minutes, okay. Just to say a final point on this directive, it is good news. It is also not the silver bullet, of course, and it's as such, it won't solve all the intricacies of discrimination that are happening in the board, but also in other levels of the hierarchy, senior management positions and the like. So some examples that are evidence, or where we can find evidence in research, in the literature, is how, for instance, we may find women on boards, but often this has been linked with family connections, for instance. So how the neutrality and the objectivity of the procedures to select those members is absolutely essential, because otherwise powerful families or people are finding the ways to put, or to choose the right persons for them, and not really changer la donne, not really advancing in terms of equality. We also have the issue of the so-called golden skirts. So a lot of same female board members actually occupying many of the positions available on boards. So that's also an issue that needs to be addressed, how to open these board positions to underrepresented, I mean, women from more diverse origins as well. And then it's the question of how the boards function within themselves. And that's an issue that we know that also affects employee representatives, for instance, when they are sitting in the board. And it's a well-known issue how they are prevented from intervening in some of the committees that are the most powerful committees, though that deciding on strategy or on nominations or pay of remuneration of directors, for instance. And this is a similar issue that we find with women presence in the board, is the fact that once they are sitting in the board, they don't have access to the same committees and the same spaces. And I leave it to that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. I interpret this as a prudently optimistic interpretation of the significance of this directive, even though it's not a silver bullet, as you said. You also mentioned the golden skirts. That was a new concept to me. Early days to make a real assessment, so we'll get back to this topic, I'm sure. You haven't talked about, and maybe there will be a question from the room afterwards, let's see, how do trade union representatives on boards react to this directive? Because also for the trade union delegations on those boards, this will have an impact, right? Mm-hmm. Some male trade unionists will have to see their place for female trade unionists, I guess, so. But let's see whether we have time to discuss that. And also for me, the broader question is whether following this legislation, I don't know, maybe Arlene wants to comment on that or somebody else, is there any scope left for any further gender equality legislation under this new European Commission? Because looking at the work program, it all looks very light and non-binding as far as I'm concerned. But we'll get back to that. Jane, you're working in the Foresight unit at the ETUI. You have a lot of experience working with different types of gender equality, also in your previous position at Massey University in New Zealand. So please tell us about gender equality from, what do we know about gender equality from existing cross-national equality indexes and studies? I know you've also done quite a bit of work for the ILO on this topic, so please enlighten us.
Thank you very much, Bart, and thank you everybody and to the speakers to my left for setting up a very nice background to this. This is kind of quite a macro commentary, I guess, a short commentary on some work that I initiated before I came to ETUI, and now I'm very happy to say continuing within the Foresight role. With a number of colleagues, Walter here in the front row, Walter Sveissen, Bart van Herke is also another member of the team, and Paula as well. So we are quite a transversal group, so I can't speak to my unit, or at least that's my excuse, okay. What I'm going to focus on today is gender equality indexes or indices. And it comes back to that. This is almost for me like basic first principles stuff about what we do next with anything with gender equity initiatives, trade union initiatives, and so forth. And as you may have heard the phrase, what gets measured gets done. And so it's very important that we have the right indexes and the measurements of things that count, that are meaningful, not just what we can measure because it's easier to measure them. So just by way of a very potted history, if you go back to look at some of the macro indices that are around, some of the indexes, these are quite often something that we draw upon almost unthinkingly these days to try and get some sense of national gender equality measure or some comparative measure. And perhaps the grandparent of them all, which came out of the United Nations Development Programme, the UNDP, is the Human Development Index. And it didn't take too long, actually, when that came out around 1990 for us to sort of say, hang on a minute, where's the gender dimension? And where's every other dimension for that matter? It's a very well-respected measure, but because of this, there were calls then to develop the kind of indices that we had to fill in some of these gaps. And so from the mid-90s, we saw a flurry of different indices coming about. And one of these, again, with which many of you will be familiar, was the Gender Development Index, GDI. And I have to warn you now, this is a field replete with acronyms. It's acronym city, so I'll try to minimize them. But we also had the Gender Empowerment Measure, the GEM or GEM. And both were critiqued nearly to death, but fairly heavily. The GDI was something that basically some have described as the Human Development Index with a gender twist. So it did go some way to recognizing gender needed to be measured, but it didn't go far enough, and it had various issues, not least about being blind to comparative gender inequality between countries. Just very quickly, the GEM, the Gender Empowerment Measure, was something that was designed to measure women and men's empowerment in various spheres, including politics, the professions, and economics areas. It too was criticised, but for different reasons. So, for example, it didn't have a lot of different national coverage. The data was a bit gappy, and various factors like that. So time precludes, and you're probably quite relieved, but time precludes me from going through other indexes. But suffice to say, we did a chapter on this in an ILO book where we talk about all of the indexes that have been used and the critiques that they've received. And you can find that online, so it's fully accessible from last year. So if we jump ahead to 2010, the UNDP then introduced something called the Gender Inequality Index, which I think is quite telling in itself, the GII. And this is something that, again, many have referenced. So, but I would have to say, another plot twist is that, yes, it is interesting, it is well used, but again, it has its own issues. And then even more recently, in 2020, recognizing that we don't just need national macro level indices, but something that digs a bit deeper, the UNDP came up with the Subnational Gender Development Index, or the SDGI. And also, as I think was alluded to before, the European Institute for Gender Equity has a Gender Equality Index, which goes some way into looking at intersectionality, and also now has some new metrics around domestic violence and so forth. So we're getting there. But again, if I were to be hypercritical in some ways, there are problems that are sustained throughout all of these indices. And they largely include things like they are pretty much still looking at binary categories of gender in most instances. They're macro level, okay? They're very quantitative. So are you really going to know what a country's gender equality situation is like just based on one measure of a gender pay gap, for example? They're decontextualized in large part. And they don't draw on a lot of qualitative or perceptual measures of equality. And let's face it, equality is about how you experience it, not just how you measure it. And also, they're often devoid of, as I say, contextual continuum. And they don't really look at the complexity of how inequities are derived in the first place and how they're perpetuated, for example, on a day-to-day level. And just finally, I don't think that we could see very many measures where there actually we have inequity measures that are interrelated. And as all the speakers here today have suggested, inequalities don't happen individually in a vacuum. They tend to tie together within and beyond the domestic and work sphere.
Thank you very much. Sorry, but this begs for a little follow-up question, Jane. So if you address in a very, very good way and very concise way all the, well, you guided us through acronym city, more or less, GDI, GM, GII, and I missed some other gappy indicators. Wouter and I love that expression I just mentioned. So what needs to be done now? What can we do as a European Trade Union Institute or other institutes or other researchers here in the room? Because I'm a bit despaired now.
Okay,
what can we do? Give me some hope here.
Don't despair. So recognizing some of these gaps that you've just identified, we're now undertaking a project within the ETUI where we're using a new organizational or institutional level equality index that looks at gender and intersectionality. It looks at it over time. It looks at the complexities of where inequalities occur. So in other words, the context and various other factors like that. It's a new measure that's been tried and tested in the public service in Aotearoa in New Zealand. It's something that we've now tried on an ETUI Women in Leadership training course and asked those participants to think about the various dimensions of the index and what it meant to them and their unions. And now we're looking at it in the context of what do trade unions in Europe do when it comes to progressing workplace equality. So we have 5 questions, and as I say, our team is Wouter, Bart, Paula, and myself, and we're taking expert advice from Aline Bousset, to my right, and also to Isabel Schumann, who was here earlier, so thank you very much to you both. It's invaluable. And the questions that we're posing are, what are the equality approaches that unions are emphasizing in workplaces? So are they being quite liberal or looking at sameness of treatment to everybody, or going through something a bit more reformist, or even redistributive, or even radical? How are they going about doing this? To what extent are they making progress? What influences this progress, and what lessons can be drawn? So we're planning some expert interviews, including with Women's Committee members from ETUC, but drawing on a survey in the Women in Leadership session that Paula ran for the ETUI, as well as documentation. Some of the key findings were as follows, and this might give you some encouragement, and I'll be really fast. Okay. There are multiple challenges, but unions are making progress on gender and to a lesser extent intersectional approaches, as we've heard this morning. As well as using union campaigns, collective bargaining and social dialogue are central to making this progress. Target areas concern not just workplace concerns, but also other spheres, as we've heard, and the union processes themselves. And while unions recognise that advances are being made, they also see that more needs to be done. And they're cognizant of various challenges, including employer resistance to meaningful social dialogue at times and collective bargaining, and also the rise of the extreme right political agents in terms of what this means for the gendering of bargaining and other agenda.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Very good. Thanks to the discipline of all the panelists and being very concise to the point, we now have some room for discussion, for questions. I'm very happy that you also stayed with us, Aline. Very good. So yeah, the floor is yours now. I don't know if there is a microphone somewhere. There must be. Voilà, Sophie is all set, so please, if you could just say briefly who you are and be rather brief in your questions, please. It's on.
I'm Lucien. I'm a researcher and currently for an internship at the ETUI, and I wanted to raise awareness on something related to the distinction between sex and gender that you made, Sonia. And a big disclaimer, I really don't want to say that the ETUI is not doing a good job on this, because I can confirm that the ETUI is a very welcoming place for everyone. But in the present context of raising attack against trans people rights, and especially trans women rights, I think it can be used in a problematic way. What I mean by that is that more and more it can be used as sex being heard as sex assigned at birth, and exclude trans women from a lot of things because they are seen as people with a male body. And this is completely false. Like transgender people and intersex people who are under hormonal treatment or any kind of treatment ends up with a body that is physiologically very close to their gender and not their assigned sex as birth. And more broadly, this distinction, when it's about something related to birth, always makes sense. But in many cases, it is used to bring back to biology when there is not necessarily this links with birth that is needed, in the sense that, yeah, like just physiologically trans women are really close to body shape, muscle, even like hormonal variation and so on. They are also exposed to this. So, and also the last thing is that I think that about what you said, you could say exactly the same using simply physiological gender difference and sociological gender difference without this additional distinction between sex and gender that is more and more used by alt-right and conservative discourses against trans people. Right?
Thank you, Lucien, for that excellent comment. We go to the lady in the back there, please.
I'm sorry, I came very, very late. I had the opportunity to listen only two of you, and especially the Women on Board directive.
Could you say where you work, please?
Yes, I'm Isabella Lenarduzzi. I'm a social entrepreneur working for gender equality, diversity and inclusion in organizations for 20 years now. And we are working a bit everywhere in Europe and also outside of Europe. And I must say that, just one thing that was said, golden skirts. As far as I know, the stats do prove that there are much fewer golden skirts than there are trousers, golden skirt trousers. So we need to pay really attention. And when you speak about diverse women that need to go on board, this is already an incredible reality. Women are younger than men on board. They are, as always, on average, more qualified. And they are coming from much different background and much different, they have much different nationalities. So in order to be a woman on board, appointed on board, you need to be the sheep with 5 legs. How do you say, to put across in all the boxes, you know? Not only you are younger, not only you have a different background, but you also have an international experience, you speak 5 languages, and so on and so on and so on. So it's important to say that in order not to say, okay, always the same women and so on. And one thing that I wanted to say is that in my fight to have more women in power in companies, I'm not supported, like Bart was saying, I'm not supported usually by the trade unions. The trade unions think that this fight is only for rich and very qualified women, that they have already everything they deserve. The fight now is for somebody else. But this is really a mistake, because my experience and all the statistics do prove that sharing the power is having more responsibility in the power, is using the power differently. And if you don't have if you don't achieve gender balance on boards, you don't achieve equal pay, you don't achieve more responsibility.
Thank you.
So the question is about, my goodness, what are you doing as trade unions? Because we need to fight on that.
We will give the floor to the trade union in a moment. Thank you for your question. There was, please.
Good evening, everybody. It's Valentina Mariani, Education Officer at ETUI. And I basically...
Sorry, Valentina. I didn't understand. I think we'll first have a comment from Fabio now. I didn't understand, sorry, Fabio.
I really apologize, but I have really to rush away, but I wanted to contribute to this interesting debate. I wanted to bring 2 points. I really think important and crucial to work for us also as men, bringing the gender perspective into the debate, affecting, for example, the reform of the democratic processes, because if we fight for equality, this is something that we definitely have an added value, because helps to approach the organization of the participatory processes, for example, with different perspectives. And secondly, looking, for example, to the trade unions, having been a trade unionist, I would say it's so important to the role that a fight for gender equality inside the organization because this produces a process of renewal itself. And it's something which is supporting the renewal of the trade union movement itself and for all, above all. And this is something extremely important about this topic. Fighting for women means to fight for all, and fighting for equality is equality for all at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fabio. And we know that you have a flight to catch, so good luck. Thank you. We remain within the Education Department. I think Valentina had asked the floor.
Yes, Valentina Mariani, Education Department, and I wanted to say something very similar to what Lucien said. So, of course, I found all your interventions very interesting, and of course, I'm saying because I believe in this. And I think that it would be very important to speak about sex assigned at birth and gender identity, because they are two different things, and they should be considered at a linguistic level, which is not only that, but it contributes to then maybe I think to understand in which way things can be transposed also into laws or into praxis, and in our cases into our jobs. So, for example, in my case, my identity is like my biological sex. It's not that. So I am a woman, but there are not only binary people. So, for example, why writing women in today's labor market and, for example, not finding another definition that could be gender identities? It's not a provocation, it's a question, because I think that if people stay invisible, they have less rights, because things have to be called, to be known, and to be thought. And it was like a little bit like what Heidegger said, but language contributes to the building of reality. So I think that we have to start to think, understand, and say that, okay, there are men, women, there are transgender people, there are non-binary people, and this is only related to gender identity, of course, not to sexual orientation. So I don't know if it's the right place to say this, but I think that you are researchers and maybe this can be interesting, for example, as to Sonia, also to design a different world, which is not designed for us as women, but it's not even designed for other identities. And for example, what Sarah said about the boards, okay, you spoke about women representation, but is there anything which is linked or which regards other identity too? Or maybe it can be discussed for the future, I mean, not for something that already exists. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I think, yes. Where's the gentleman on? No, we change sides of the room and then again. Gentleman.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Erwin Borgert. I'm an intern at the German Bar Association, and my question is more directed to Sonia. At the end of your speech, you have been talking about a study where males have been found more efficient and productive in comparison to women. And I wanted to ask what work fields have been looked upon, and you also talked about that you need to find some ways to make it more suitable for the woman body, and what exact measurements are meant by that.
Thank you so much. And then there was a question over there. Now we'll bring it back to this side of the room and see whether there are some final questions afterwards, please. It's working.
It's working, okay. So I wanted to have some terminology clarification about the directive we were talking about, because the terminology, as I understood it, was underrepresented sex. So I wanted to know why sex and not gender. And also it was on the singular in sex, because even if we're just talking about sex, like intersex people exist, they're actually quite represented, like it's around 1 or 2% of the population, which is something significant. And yeah, gender could also be plural if we escape the binary of gender, which would be also interesting. to include non-binary people and gender non-conforming people. So yeah, it was just about terminology.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think, except if there are any two-hands interventions, things that need to be said very urgently, we now take it back to this side of the room. So Lucien from the ETUI, and welcome to the ETUI, by the way, was asking a question about the sex gender dimension. What about trans women, transgender? I don't know if Sonia or somebody wants to comment on that. Then there was the comment on the golden skirt versus the golden trousers. Maybe Sarah, you can say something on that, but also a very important aspect from you. How do trade unions situate themselves with regard to this directive? And maybe Aline wants to comment on that. And then while you're at it, Aline, what about the new European Commission? Any important new legislation ahead on gender equality? Would be happy to hear you about that. Then Valentina, the importance of the right labels, the right words, the right jargon, which reminds me that, by the way, that until 3 months ago, I opened every conference by saying, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. Until somebody came to tell me, I didn't feel involved in your conference because, you know. So thank you for that. The colleague from the German bars, male efficiency, males higher efficiency productivity, Sonia, that will be for you. And I think that gives a role to nearly every one of you. Nothing specific for Jane,
It's okay.
but you will come up with something to answer to, I'm sure. Who wants to go first? Sarah, you're ready, go.
I may start, maybe not with all at once, but thank you very much for the reactions. I mean, this is why we organize these kind of events, to have a bit of discussion and be stimulated as well. So yeah, perhaps starting, well, maybe to react on the golden skirt, well, on your comment, which was very pertinent actually, right? The fact that it looks like we're asking women to prove, what did you say, the sheep with 5 legs or something. That definitely reminded me or brought me to some discussions that are actually happening within the trade union movement when they need to provide for representatives to some of these boards. Because I don't know if you are all aware, but I may say in some member states, there are norms that oblige companies to have board workers represented on the boards or on the supervisory boards. And that means that unions, that this directive indirectly is also affecting the unions that need to appoint their own representatives to these bodies. Because then the question is, and often this 40% that applies to the non-executive members, actually means that trade unions are also put pressure on by the employers to bring on their ladies to fill this quota that in fact the company needs to fill. And so this is a quite sad discussion, but it motivates some negotiations, very hard ones, because of course unions are also confronted with renewing their own ranks and finding women and opening positions and political positions in their ranks to the underrepresented sex. So it's already an ongoing worry and discussion, and there are different, well, probably Aline will be able to speak, because I'm not, I'm a unionist, but I'm here as a researcher, so not to confuse the roles here. But basically, for sure, this is an aspect that also involves the unions. And I can just say, because I had some data to show that how this also affects unions. In some databases that we have in-house in ETUI, refer to board-level employee representatives in European companies. These are data quite original that we do have in-house. And we can see that in 2024, from 280 individuals that we could count representing workers in these company boards of European companies, only 31% were women. So on the worker side, the unions, the worker representatives could only fill 1/3, I mean, not even 1/3 with women. So that means that there are efforts being made, but there's still some parcours to be filled. And I think in that regard, sorry, but Fabio also mentioned, this directive is also an incentive perhaps, and will have some spillover as well within the union movement to push forward for renewal and for also making the appropriate turnover as well for women in their...
Which I think, thank you so much, Sarah. I think that seamlessly brings us to Aline. Women on boards means women workers representatives on board. So how is this discussion going, resonating within the trade union movement?
Yeah. So as you have said in the beginning, this directive was sleeping for a long time, and then it was awake again. We have welcomed the directive, and I would like to thank the person who intervened, because I think you made very, very valid points. However, you can't blame me for saying that if we say diverse women, I mean, I'm speaking about class also. So what we want to see, is women workers from a working class background making their way into the boardrooms. And that links up to the main ETUC criticism about the directive, because what we haven't seen in that directive is stepping stones, meaning mentorship, training, something that would allow me from a shop floor level, let's say, to get into senior management and to actually climb my way up, right? So for us, the main criticism was, or the main risk we see with this directive, and of course it's a good directive, but the main risk really we see is that it's kind of privileged women who maybe come in, and Sarah, I think you put it very well, women who already have better access kind of to these roles and positions, for them to be, to now have more access and to now be included in boards. So that's the main criticism. I understand your point of view, and I think it's very valuable, but for us, we would have wanted to see some stepping stones in between, because, to make it to the boardroom, that's not only with a quota. And that's what's missing in the directive. I can speak about the Commission also.
Yes, I was going to suggest.
Should I do that
Thank
now?
you. Yes, please.
Okay. Actually, it's a good bridge, because the Commissioner for Equality, she's also Commissioner for other things now.
Commissioner for other things.
Yeah, so basically, okay, so her name is Hadja Labib, she comes from the Belgium MR, and she is Commissioner for Crisis Management, Preparedness and Equality. Before we had a Commissioner only for Equality, but times are a-changing. And basically, we haven't met her yet, but I know that women in leadership, for example, and women entrepreneurs is, I think, a very big priority for Hadja Labib, which is very interesting. Yeah, you good news. So what's coming out of the Commission? We had the roadmap. We spoke about the roadmap. For me, this is, I think for the ETUC, I think it's a bit worrying. The roadmap is a political reaffirmation of core principles. The roadmap is optional for member states and stakeholders to sign. We heard it. So if a member state says, maybe no more gender equality, that's absolutely fine. We have normally, gender equality is enshrined in the European treaties, so farming this off to if you want to join, cool. If you don't want to join, also cool. That's a very, very questionable approach by the European Commission, and I will say that very harshly. The only thing that gives me hope is the upcoming gender equality strategy, because there will be one, and in that strategy we will have measures and instruments, something that's lacking in the roadmap. We will come in very heavy, of course, and we are preparing the whole consultation with the Women's Committee. The strategy should be ready in March 2026, so 1 year ahead. But again, to everything I'm hearing from the side of the Commission is we have done so much in the last term, right? We have done so many things, which is not wrong. We have the Pay Transparency Directive, we have the directive combating violence against women, the Women on Boards Directive got over the line, the Work-Life Balance Directive still, they adopted in 2019, I think. So it's true that there are a lot of things, but now they're it's been enough, right? And the most worrying thing, and for the ETUC, and that's also not a surprise, is of course everything pertaining to competitiveness. So if you want to pitch something to the European Commission in terms of gender equality, basically you should say, how much economic impact this will have and how much it can unleash businesses' potential, because that's a narrative that really works well at the moment. It's not a narrative that trade unions are used to bring forward. So we are in an era of simplification and seeking competitiveness. So in fairness, I'm a bit pessimistic. But we'll do our job. Like,
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Aline. Now, I heard the colleague from the German bar say, Sonja, that you explained to us that males are more efficient and productive than females. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. Yes, I would like to comment on that definitely, but first I would like to thank for the comments from Lucian and Valentina. I absolutely agree with your comments. And before I was preparing to speak today, I was thinking about whether to mention it or not. But taking into account that this event was for the celebration of the Women's Day and to focus specifically on the issues of women in the labor market, I decided to talk about the sex and gender and how it impacts women. But of course, someone said if people stay invisible, they have less rights, and this is absolutely true. During the conference we had in December, I don't know if you were with us, Lucian, then, but we had a specific panel on queer community. Marwan was chairing that session, and we had exactly that issues of the working conditions for queer community and the specific actions that are being taken by trade unions in different countries to support and to also raise awareness. So I'm happy to discuss it further on. And to address the other comment about the research that I was referring to. So again, to bring a little bit of context, I was referring to the research that has been mentioned during the conference by Karen Messing when she was discussing the differences of or how sex and gender impacts the workplace design and how the workplace is being designed for men and not for women. And in that presentation, she was giving example of a workplace for, I think it was a mechanic shop or a place that was a physical job where women and men had both the same tools. And because women on average are shorter than men, because they had a shorter tools, they weren't able to reach as high or as efficiently to where they were supposed to like screw something, and that's why they were slower in their job. But when they were given tools that were longer and they were designed for their body, they were actually faster and more efficient in their job. So a bit of context there, maybe clarification. There were another examples that were being given by Karen. It is in the recording, so I strongly advise you to listen to that. It's very, very interesting. And she has a chapter in the report that has been published in 2021 in our institute as well. So yeah, I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, so there were several comments about, sex, gender. Jane, you mentioned issues with regard to indexes that are binary. So I'm wondering to what extent the issue of terminology and using the right labels, to what extent that is important in the kind of research that you do also with regard to data gathering.
Yeah, well, I think I'd follow Valentina's lead here in terms of the significance of language, in terms of guiding then what we look at, how we look at it, and what we think problems and solutions are. I mean, for example, I wouldn't mind wearing golden trousers, so you know, the divides are fluid, in my opinion. So I just wanted to, though, focus more on, I think Aline made a really key point when she talked about, with regard to women on boards and the directive in that area, and the need for what I would call flanking with things like training and mentorship of women. That's imperative, and most gender equality studies demonstrate that where they're most successful is where they have multiple efforts that interlock or coordinate well, not just a singular activity. And I would also suggest, therefore, that whatever happens on boards is linked in, therefore, to strategies elsewhere, be it within the organisation and beyond. So it's useful to look at directives that focus on one particular aspect of where we can increase the index, or the indices, if you like, but keeping it within that wider strategy, which goes beyond the workplace. So just a very, very sort of generic comment there.
Okay. Paula, is there any of the points that you would like to?
Yes, I also would like to say something about the women in trade unions and in occupying positions of power in trade unions. We are working really hard at the ETUI to have this program for women leaders, and actually is a very, very good place for the participants that come every year to every single edition to reflect on their skills, the things that they would like to improve to feel more confident. But it's also a very nice place to talk about different kind of leadership styles, also the feminist leadership style, and how to transform power once you are occupying a power position. So we work with a group for about 6 months. We do this training program in 2 face-to-face weeks, plus different intermediate online periods. And we discuss different topics. We do capacity building, but at the same time, we go into very important reflections. We want women to be in trade union boards, and we also want them to stay there, because it's also true that when a woman is in a powerful position, sometimes she's there for a shorter period than a man. And we want them to be there, and we want them to stay. And this is what we are trying to do in the education department as well.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see, it's getting late. We're still on schedule, but I don't want to retain you longer than needs be. So let's see if there are any final comments, statements, questions, issues to be raised to our remarkable panel here. I see that Kalina wants to interview. Yeah, we still have time, huh? So please go ahead. Kalina, you go first. And then Maria decides who goes next. It's on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually wanted to speak a little bit on the point that was mentioned about trans women, but trans people in general, maybe non-binary. So just, stepping out of the binary distinctions, but also the distinction between gender and sex. I want to be fully honest about it. I think that this is something that we can all probably learn a little bit more, not a little bit, quite a lot more on. In general, society in general. I think I will refer back to what Sonia said about the panel that we had, which was a really, really fantastic panel at the OSH conference, which looked a little bit more closely into these issues, because as Lucien said, I think it's so important. I think there's a very, very little understanding of the ways in which hormone treatment impacts people's bodies, impacts behavior. There's also questions around things like, what about if you start hormone therapy, if you have surgery, can you take time off and things like this? So I think certainly for me in my research, this is something I want to learn a lot more about. I also want to refer to Karen Messing's work. She wrote a fantastic book. What was it called? Bent Out of Shape. Yes, that's right. And there she talks a little bit about, it's not just that gender is a continuum, it's not binary. I think she made the interesting point that sex is also in some ways a continuum, because we all have different characteristics, different hormone levels, and that's something that I think is really, really important also in the sphere of occupational health and safety. I also really appreciated the point about intersex people. I think that is a minority that's often not talked about very much. There's very little knowledge. And so, again, I do want to refer to that fantastic panel, watch it. I think there was some really interesting points made there. But like I said, I think it would be really great if we saw a lot more research in general. I mean, not just at ETUI. I think we're starting to talk about this, which I'm very happy about. But it was just a point.
A comment. Thank you, Kalina. Okay, there were some, yes, colleague who intervened about.
Yeah, just a reaction on Paula's latest comment about what I felt it was about fixing women, about providing training for their leadership and so on. But we have to be very cautious about that. Who needs to be fixed? Trade unions. And who is the majority in trade unions? Men. So we need to fix the culture that is most probably not inclusive enough. Instead of asking women to be tougher, to be one, I would like to have many more men trying to be like the so-called, and I don't accept that, the female leadership with more empathy, more, we always ask women to be fixed and we don't think about fixing the men and fixing really the working culture. So we need to, I understand what you say, and of course we have our share of responsibility, but we need to pay attention, because otherwise it sends also always the message, you see, women have not what it takes in order to succeed. They need a specific leadership training.
All right, this is getting very interesting. Do you want to react to that comment? That would be wonderful. Oh, sorry. So before you go on, then, is there somebody who would like to react to that comment in the audience, or would like to build on that point before we take it back? No, not the case. Ah, yes, please. Yeah. No. Sorry. First, the.
Okay, sorry.
Or fixing men.
Absolutely. Yeah, but she was like saying that we were asking for women to change and we could ask for men to change, which I agree with it. We could definitely ask for men to be more inclusive and other things. But it was on the conference itself that talks about modifying the workplace, and it's just, I think I didn't really understand what was the concept.
Okay.
But I think there is more clarification.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'm going to ask Aline. Why you? But not now. You can reflect a bit. Fixing men, fixing women, fixing workplaces, fixing trade unions. A lot needs to be fixed here. So if you want to comment on that, Aline, that would be great. Or somebody else. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I just wanted two small things. First on the indices, but in fact, trade unions, they're using like the gender wage gap. And there's now also the gender care gap, what I saw, and the gender pension gap. But you didn't talk about that, because I think that these are really on our topics. And then on the leadership, and also the fact that women leaders are quitting more sooner than male leaderships or male leaders. From my background, so I'm now at the University of Hasselt, but I worked as a gender equality officer in the Belgian trade union, and what I saw, what is important is that you are backed by a collective, by a women's committee or equality committee or like equality bodies. So to what extent do you also include that? And I recently had a question like, how to integrate more migrant women in the trade union. And so, and she approached it very individually, but I said, no, you have to do it collectively. So what is also the approach, the collective approach towards, more equality? And maybe that also responds to what Isabella says. Because I'm not so negative as you. I see a lot of changes from when I started at the training and now. I think we have already progressed a lot, and we should also acknowledge that. And of course, we are not there, but the economy is very harsh also. So we are confronted with a very harsh environment. And so we should also look at how, in which environment do we have to function as a trade union. And then maybe just, sorry, a very other one. I also, so we expect that there will be a gradual increase of women in local committee and local representation. But what I fear is that this care gap will put an additional burden, especially on women, and that that the increase will stop of women. That's what we saw in the elections, social elections of Belgium. You see that there's a stagnation.
Thanks very much. Now, while our panelists reflect on who would like to comment on what, we already know that Aline is keen to intervene straight away. So just very quickly, it's a bit of a, I don't know, I'm a bit hesitant whether I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. So with regard to the question of gender, sex, non-binary, I have to admit that I have a bit of a struggle myself with that. So I was a few months ago at a dinner where I assumed woman next to me asked for the butter or something. So I told a colleague, could you pass her the butter, please? This person, this woman that was sitting next to me got very upset. I have not told you that I feel like a woman. Would you please not assume that? And in all honesty, there I'm lost. So I'm very happy. We should speak about labels, and we should speak about being, I don't know, accommodating and being respectful, etc. And I also feel that we need to be able to continue having relaxed and normal conversations. So there, if somebody can help me that now or during the break or whenever, Marwan, I'm looking at you more specifically, because I feel you want to say something now. You have a question later, because there I think it's just to be honest, I feel that sometimes it's getting very complicated. In all honesty, but that's the perspective of an older man, I suppose. Marwan.
It's not related to that, though.
Good.
Is just one more question, if I may add. We've been talking about the research at ETUI level, which is amazing, and we've seen it here. But sadly, we're not reaching, and I'm raising the same argument I used in our OSH and gender conference. We're not reaching the people we want, because if you see the crowd,
Preaching to the converted.
I do not need to add anything else. You already understood me. But the question is slightly different. I had a personal experience as well. So 3 weeks ago, I was involved in a selection committee for researchers that were coming to Europe, and we're struggling a bit because I will try to be as careful as possible because I cannot say some stuff. But politically, the country that was sending those researchers changed the wing. And they were asked not to do research on gender, LGBTQI+ community, and climate. And actually, we solved it. It's not happening anymore, but it will happen in the future. And we already know that, sadly. So my question is, what's our role as ETUI? Because the research is amazing, but what happens in the other side of the world might also happen here at some point.
Very interesting. Okay. Gonna take it back to the panel. If there are no other questions, comments, intervention, no, we're good. And ask each of you for your final mini statement, picking up on one of the comments, one of the question, or just your takeaway message. And we will start with Aline.
Yeah, maybe very briefly on the Women on Boards discussion. Again, I think your points are valuable. However, fixing women by, making training and mentorship available is one very selective way of seeing that, you know. I think, like, I'm from a working class background, and if I didn't have any mentorship in my workplace, I wouldn't sit here now with a microphone in front of my face. So, you know, it's not about fixing, I think, right? And also maybe one last point is, I've read that recently, the expression of trickle-down feminism. I think it doesn't work. Meaning, if we have women in leadership, you know, the assumption that it would trickle down and then, you know, kind of elevate all women from all kind of backgrounds, including class, including gender identity, including sexual orientation, including ethnic background. I think it doesn't work. So again, my plea for the Women on Boards Directive is good. There should have been more, and we will still look how we can use it to the fullest. And lastly, I think, yes, trade unions need to be fixed, and I said that also in my presentation. I don't know if you were already in the room when I gave that, because trade unions don't prioritize always matters relating to gender equality. That's absolutely correct. We see that also when it comes to gender-based violence. But I mean, we are all here kind of working on that, and we will continue to do that. So.
Thank you. All right, Jane?
Okay. Thank you very much. Just following on from Aline then. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, and I think perhaps more widely, gender equality and equity studies are a perpetual work in progress. So even when we make gains, we have to be mindful of stopping them from being clawed back as well, given political exigencies and so forth. And I'm just reminded I was reading something by Rosemary Warscott. It's a 20-year-old piece where she starts looking at history of feminism 60 years ago, talking about socialist feminist project, which we might want to return to at some point. And then the response to neoliberalism by the working class, bringing in women into unions that way. And then the response to now looking at mainstreaming of gender. And so these different approaches that ebb and flow and run alongside each other. And frankly, yeah, I mean, I think you can see some objective progress both within and beyond unions. But I would definitely suggest that, you know, we need to go back to first base really and think about what is it, the ideologies that we're pushing with these approaches and how do they interrelate with the other macro transitions that we're all experiencing.
All right, excellent. Sarah, final statement?
I'll try a conciliatory ending note, if I may. So back to what Aline just said in reaction, right? I don't think it's about fixing women, but about creating opportunities for equity. And that means both, right? So creating means for empowering women and at the same time empowering and allowing this access, and at the same time also changing the rules of the game that's already there. And I think the directive, with all the limitations, but it attempted to this when it creates the means to achieve these objectives by, let's say, changing or prepare these selection processes in an objective and neutral formulated manner. In a way, it's also trying to create it, to change the procedures and to make them more transparent. So it should affect both ways. Actually, social partners could play some role in this kind of concretion of how this is going to be made. And on the sex issue, the terminology, non-binary and so on, I fully, share what has been said, and I'm very sensitive to that personally. At the same time, when you look at this issue as a researcher, we have to admit that this topic, this underrepresentation sex, which clearly addresses women, but not literally, has been blocked for 10 years, very recently, because member states, because many societies in Europe were still not prepared to assume that there should be women quota on the board of companies. This is the state of play in our society, unfortunately, very unfortunate, but it is the context we are working with. And I think that's already a first step, a big achievement, also for the feminist movement, but for non-discrimination movements in general. So then how we can move forward from there, I think that will be the next things we have to reflect upon.
Yes, regarding the question about the education programs, at the beginning I explained that we mainstream gender equality topics in different kind of trainings. And we also work on specific training courses address for women, because we want to create safe spaces to make and enlarge brave spaces. So it's not about fixing women. It's about having a space to reflect and to see where do you want to go and how long are you going to stay there. So this is, and I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding in the message. And I will give the floor to Sonia.
You were given the floor by Paula.
Thank you for the floor, Paula. Yes, well, my conclusions maybe are not very hopeful, but the progress takes painfully slow, it seems like, and women take a lot of time to reach equity at the labor market, but the other minority groups can maybe learn from that progress way, and hopefully we will get faster to the equity with other minorities at the labor market. The question that I have that's stuck in my mind is Marwan's question. Okay, we are all here and we are already aware of the issue, and how to reach people who are less aware of the issue. That is the question that will stay with me after this conference. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Sonia. So we have to wrap. I hope you agree that it was, especially the colleagues who organized this event, that it was a good idea to make much more space for Q&A rather than from lengthy conclusions. So I'll just be very brief, a few minutes, not really concluding, but just saying I have the impression at the ETUI, we're doing a good job on gender equality, and I want to be very modest about what we do at the same time. In the sense that, so we have our horizontal working group, we have a batch of research touching upon gender equality, and it continues. We have all our education activities. And to be completely honest with you, the gender dimension is not fully mainstreamed in our work. It's a fact. We're working on it, we're getting there, and there is still work to be done. And I just want to give you one quick illustration. Yesterday, I was together with my colleague Fabio Gelfi at a brainstorm with one of the networks of the education department with far-right trainers. And I listed a battery of topics that ETUI could, sorry, far-right trainers, yes, okay. Trainers would learn, would teach, who engage with national trade unions to counter the far right. Yes. Okay, that's better. Yes, thank you. So I listed a number of topics that we could deal with, that we are going to deal with, etc. And then after, also maybe typically a bit after the end of the event, a Finnish lady came to me and said, "You may have missed one key dimension: gender. What is going to happen with the far? What is happening when the far right gets into power? What about the gender dimension? It's quite strange that as a man you don't think of that." I found it also quite interesting that this lady came to tell me that after the discussion, instead of raising the point in front of everybody and confronting me with it. So the gender dimension is there from all sides, just very quickly. Second quick point, what about gender equality in our own workplace? I think there again, I need to be, as a manager, a bit modest. Just very quickly, we have 3 male directors at the ETUI, and 3 female heads of unit. Just saying. I see that men are more active in the Institute in applying for a promotion or a pay rise than women are. Just saying. I realized that if and when I get an application for a promotion, for example, a man or a woman, do I look at those applications in the same way? Should I look at them in a different way? Because men or women apply them. And again, I'm talking about men, women, very binary, right? So just questions, not answers at this stage. What I also see in our institute, sometimes women, especially younger women, are interrupted in the middle of their speech by men, namely by middle-aged men like myself, etc. So there are a number of issues that are out there. I don't think there is bad intention. I think most of us here in the room, we're all a bit the coalition of the willing. And there is still a lot to be done there. We mentioned the very good session in the OSH final conference on periods and menopause, and that it's when I left there, I was like, yes, we're going to do something, but that, of course, nothing happened. So, you know, I want to be modest. We do great things, but in our institute, I think there is still scope for progress, and we need to repeat this issue. And then secondly, very quickly, just from my own, let's say, male, middle-aged perspective, if and when I work at the institute, sometimes I work late, whether it's 6 or 10 or 12 at night, I walk to Gare du Nord, I feel perfectly safe. Some of our female colleagues tell me that they don't go to Gare du Nord after 6 p.m. When I heard that, I didn't realize it, and it is true. I see some people nodding in the room. When my daughter walks with her girlfriend through the city in Leuven, she sometimes feels unsafe when they walk hand in hand, especially. That is a very big problem, I think. Yeah, I could give some other examples, but let's not make it too personal. So I think a lot of progress has been made, and there is no room for complacency. So that's why I'm very happy that we organized this event. So I want to thank Kalina and Wouter and Paula. Our fantastic panelists and my dear colleague Aline, who did a great job in the previous panel. So thank you for that as well. And then our colleagues from Compub, Beth is here, Maria Nikolova, and Sophie, who organized this event in practical. Thank you so much. Stay in touch, and we keep up the good work. Thanks.
Thank you.